The girl across the hall starts talking. She asks, but who she's addressing? We don't know that right now. The question is, what happens if a battle starts and one of the troops is 37,463 men, and the number of their opponents is 3 times as large, amounting to 100,000 men? Raising her index finger, the blonde-haired girl finally puts a stop to the question and specifies who will win in this case. And then we see 4 guys standing across the street. There's silence. They don't know the answer. You can see it in their rounded eyes or furrowed brows. Fadian twisted her snow-white hair around her finger and closed her eyes. She exhaled and asked why they were so quietly upsetting her with their silence. Something rustled, and everyone turned toward the sound. A guy with golden hair and a ponytail raised his hand and said that the first ones would win. There was hope in the girl's blue eyes, and as she looked at him, she clarified why the first army would win. Najin quietly repeated the exact number of men in the first army, adding that an army lacking organizational skills would not win. Everyone stood and looked at each other in silence, waiting for the teacher to answer, and only the quiet whimpering of a man sleeping on the steps was audible. Her face showed relief, and with a thumbs up she said, "The answer is right. Remember, the power is in knowledge, and those who remember can become true knights. So, who are the knights? Justice and honor are what they are. Heroes of the time who are willing to risk their lives for honor and justice." Fadian let out a tear of mockery, asking how they had answered so quickly, adding that she hated Najin. The boys looked at her without understanding. Then she laughed and pointed her finger at them, asking if they remembered tomorrow's exam, as it was just a warm-up. The boys continued to listen to her. One of them even bent down with his palms on his knees. All the others seemed to be at a loss for words. Fadian kept talking non-stop about how she wasn't going to cut them any slack, and from the looks of it, she was very amused. Sweat was already beading on Rujian's and Tara's faces as they waited for her to stop talking. Turning around and announcing that they were done for the day and that Najin was free, everyone else should do 100 push-ups before leaving. Tar and Rujian looked grudgingly in Najin's direction, envious of his good fortune. The girl advised the guys not to quarrel, or she would fight again, and disappeared with a clap. And so, at last, they were alone in a room, alone with silence. In hysterics, Rujian yelled, not realizing when they would finish the push-ups. Raojun was running around the room, worried about passing the exam. Tar was poking at the sleeping Roos. Tar continued to poke at the lifeless body, but only unintelligible sounds came out. Thar questioned Roos as he passed out after the first punch. "But hitting a teacher is no joke," Ruth said. He looked ragged, and his mouth was drooling. After fixing his clothes, Najin went somewhere. Raojun asked if he was going home, and Jin gave a short, "Uh-huh." Fujian stood aside and looked at them sullenly. Suddenly she shouted, "Are you happy to be free before anyone else?" Rujin's face showed envy, but Jin gave up just as briefly, of course. Rujian continued to yell and was overcome with rage. "You saw for yourself what was happening at the training session." Jin heard behind him and stopped. Suddenly, they both moved towards each other sharply to clarify their relationship, but didn't notice the figure that appeared between them. The blow landed right in the face of Fadian, who had appeared out of nowhere. Her eyes went wide with pain and surprise. She wanted to intercept the arm flying at her, but the next blow didn't take long. Rujian swooped down on Jin with such speed that she couldn't orient herself as he was already throwing punches at her opponent's face. Fadian accelerated. Fadian flew over the tangle of arms and legs, from which the sounds were coming, and moved toward Russ. He stared at her and froze. Clenching her fists, she moved with such speed that only her bright blue eyes could be seen, that it made Russ's face break out in drops of sweat. And so she strikes right into her opponent's stomach with such force that he bends in half. Then she leaned on the other leg without losing her grip. Ruth had already fallen to his knees with his head up. Everyone else watched with bated breath. Rujian glared angrily in her direction. Tar wiped his mouth with his sleeve behind them. Najin stood as a steady statue. Rujian threw herself at Jin again, grabbing him by the collar of his jacket and yelling at him as if he could stand there and just watch. Jin listened silently to another tantrum. Anger enveloped Rujian. She yelled that Jin was stronger than all of them, and why then did he ignore it? So, Rujian clenched and made a fist again. Najin's face was as cold as ice. He stared at the fist flying toward him without moving. In front of Jin's face, his hand is intercepted by Raojun, who squeezes it and asks Rujian to stop. Clenching his hand, he looked at Rujian with green eyes that were slightly hidden by his black hair, reminding him that if they put up a fight, they would be disqualified. Ruth clutched his sweater tightly with worry, and Tar squinted at him in bewilderment. Najin stepped back and turned away from them. Raojun said just as sternly that it was better to go train. He tried to put his hand on Rujian's shoulder to quiet her down a bit, but she pulled her hand out, and with a disgruntled face, she clucked. Ruth, clutching his sweater, asked if there was anything wrong with the teacher getting angry. Tar glanced at him in shock at that statement. Rujin was not going to calm down and continued to lash out at Najin, saying that his temper had always been bad, but now it was even worse. Raojun stood up for Jin, looking in his direction, and asked him not to judge him, because everyone knew what had happened to him recently. Rough Jane turned her head and looked toward the floor with a frown. "The pain of losing a family is hard to imagine," Raojun whispered. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, and then it stopped. Najin stepped outside and looked up at the flying birds in the sunset sky. Breathing in the cold air, he exhaled and lowered his head, simply standing amidst a sky filled with bright colors. He stood there thinking how lucky he was that he hadn't been caught, after all. In his memoirs, he stood in front of his house, or instead, in front of what was left of it, a charred ruin. Everyone knows about it. It was like he was standing in those flames himself, thinking of his only brother, who had been reduced to ashes. He had one thought in his head: there is a secret that no one knows about. Remembering how he stood with sword in hand in the middle of a burning house over the lifeless body of his brother Nagyan. Clenching his teeth, he thought back to that moment. Nagyan had killed his brother himself. A week before it happened, Nagyan sat on the cold floor leaning against a brick wall. Two men stood in front of him. Covering his face with his hand, he looked closely at the people who had come to him. The three boys looked at him questioningly. Rujian leaned right up to his face. He fell to the floor, making unintelligible noises. His long yellow hair completely covered his face. Rujian grabbed her head and turned around, ordering the others to go. Ruth was chewing on something, staring at the body in front of him. Spitting the gum right on the head of the lying man and swearing obscene phrases, they left. Nagyan stood up and reached into his hair, finding something. He tugged at a lock and saw a sticky rubber tangled in his hair. He leaned his head against the cold brick wall with a groan. He wanted to say something, but he didn't have the strength. His figure sat unmoving in silence. He thought about how much he hated this village. On the shelf lay a magazine with a portrait and profile of Najin, with a shadow leaning over it. Nagyun, with disheveled hair, looked sadly at the magazine. Putting a couple of gold coins in the basket, he asked for one to be given to him. The magazine immediately flew straight at him. He tried to cover his face with his hands but didn't have time, and the magazine flew into his head. He looked at the tall salesman with the mustache, who was looking skeptically at Nagyun with his arms folded. There was a bang. The magazine fell to the ground in a puddle. He bent down to pick it up and thought about how, when he first started living here, he had learned well how to read people's emotions. Picking up the magazine, he gave the same look to the salesman because he had learned to make the same face. The main thing is not to laugh or cry. The salesman looked at Nagyun, turned around, and left. Nagyun kept thinking at that moment that he should not express his emotions. Turning his back on the store, he walked away, still thinking that this was the only way to avoid bullying. Still, he was always overwhelmed with emotion himself. Walking down the street, turning the soggy pages of a magazine, his thoughts were on his brother. After all, he's a rising star. The hand clutched the page with Najin's picture. Here, he is the disciple all the knights want to get, #1 in popularity in the entire country. He smiled warmly at his brother's photo, but he couldn't always hide his emotions. The man with brown eyes shifted his eyebrows with a stern look and said, "Half." Nagyun was stunned at the news and stared at him with round eyes. His head was spinning with what for. A man dressed in black towered over him. He said they had taken care of everything. Nagyun was only worried about why they would only pay half of it. The question didn't bother him, and in answering it, he reminded him that Nagyun had left work in the middle of the day, which meant he would be fined. Nagyun was taken aback and began to make hasty excuses that it was all Rujin's and the boys' fault because they had beaten him up. The quarter answered the interlocutor and still looked sternly at the young man. Nagyun lowered his head, clutching the magazine in his hand. He was shaking. The boss kept pressing him, saying that no one would hire Nagyun to join him. "Here we go again." Nagyun looked into the stern face, closed his eyes and lowered his head. He can't cry or get angry. He continued to stand with his head down. People went about their business and did not notice them. The magazine in his hand was already just a crumpled pile of paper, and his fist clenched tighter and tighter. In his mind, he deserved it. Behind Nagyun's back, people shouted that it was him. He didn't turn around, but he knew who was there. He saw a stone flying at him and dodged it. It fell to the ground. A crowd of guys stood behind him with a racket in their hands. One of them was laughing at the other for not hitting the target. Nagyun was embarrassed, and the next stone flew straight at his head. Memories flashed before his eyes. He's a little man, standing in front of a pillar of flame. 10 years ago, he started the fire. Holding the same magazine dedicated to his brother and leafing through it, he thought that it would soon be over. Suddenly, Nagyon falls. Someone pushed him. He sits on the ground, and they give him a hand and apologize. He looked at the one offering him help and saw his brother. Nagyon smiled and asked if everything was all right. Taking his brother's hand firmly, he said it was okay and stood up. They stood opposite each other, still clasping each other's hands. Nagyon looked at his brother and saw him as a hero, for he had saved people from the fire at a young age. Nagyon put his arm around his brother's shoulder and they left. A man with dark hair stared after them. In Nagyon's hands, Nagyon noticed a magazine with his picture in it and cheerfully asked if that was why he bought it. Nagyon started to stammer. He decided to pretend he was seeing his brother's picture in a magazine for the first time. Nagyon was embarrassed and put his hands behind his head. Taking Nagyon by the shoulder, Nagyon laughed and said it was just a joke, but Nagyon was upset. But Nagyon decided to distract his brother from that and showed him a picture of the sea in a magazine, asking if he would be interested. When he saw the photo in the magazine, Nagyon closed his eyes and clutched the magazine to his chest. He smiled, telling his brother that they would live in a world where Nagyon was a knight and he was an adventurer. Nagyon looked at him and mumbled a short, "uh-huh." Approaching a 2-story house among the trees, Nagyon stopped waiting for his brother and asked why he wasn't upset. Nagyon hoped he would miss him. When he opened the door to the house, he kept talking about how he would get an internship and a grant, looking at his brother's serious face. But he couldn't finish. In the house stood many people in robes with hoods pulled over their heads and red and blue masks covering their faces. Nagyon dared to ask what they were doing in their house, but along with his words came a rustle, and he saw a sword coming towards his face. Nagyon managed to get between his brother and the cloaked stranger, intercepting his arm. The sword slammed into the door jamb. Holding his sword hand confidently above him, Nagyon looked sternly at the strangers. Behind him stood a surprised Nagyon. The strangers began to whisper amongst themselves. One pointed out that it was Nagyon who stopped the sword. His interlocutor confirmed that he was strong. "Who are you?" Nagyon shouted, but there was a rustle, and his brother's hand raised to tell him to shut up. Continuing to hold his hand in the air, Jin began to quietly say that, judging from the previous swing, these people were a real threat to them. Nagyon was shocked because Jin said they had come to kill him. He stared at his brother, unsure of what would happen next. Jin laughed. The masked man asked if he would let him do it so easily. The stranger's eyes were invisible in the darkness, except for the pupils, which glowed. "No," Nagyon replied and kicked the stranger with all his might, knocking him into the wall. Without thinking long, he grabbed the hilt of the sword stuck in the doorway and thought about the fact that the advantage was not on his side. Looking at the crowd of opponents who were already holding swords, he kept thinking the most important thing was not to start fighting in a small room where he could be squeezed from all sides. He closed the door, leaving his brother outside. He couldn't let him be taken hostage, for then he wouldn't be able to do anything and would be left alone with his enemies. He stood and drew his sword in front of him. Surrounded, he thought about isolating them from himself. The brother was banging on the door, shouting and calling for Nagyon. He asked to open the door. He heard his brother's voice outside the door, but he also listened to a sword whistle from the side and a wound open on his cheek. He retaliated with a kick to his opponent's waist, hitting right on target. There were too many of them. They were everywhere, from the front to the side behind him. All that was visible was the glint of blades and the sound of them slicing through the air. Seeing the enemies in front of him, he analyzed. He can't attack in tight quarters. The one in the center has to be careful. He must be the leader. He realized that one of the figures was standing still with his arms folded, not moving. It was strange. The mysterious figure at that very moment was contemplating how they should be, for they were much stronger than anyone could have guessed. His hand reached for the sword hanging in its scabbard at his side. There was no time to delay. Nagyon knocked on the door and tried to shout to his brother to see how he was doing. Suddenly, a blade cut through the door, and he stammered and said he would call for help. Before he could step back, the door shattered into splinters, and he could only cover his face with his hands. In the opening, he saw his brother standing and holding a sword straight out in front of him. Standing with his head down, Nagyon realized the right decision didn't always lead to victory. Blood was dripping down his arms, and his opponent was preparing to strike in front of him. His opponent continued to hold the sword, saying that he didn't think Nagyon would be able to repel this blow, and added that he looked terrible. Drawing his sword again at the young man, he threw it at him and saw if you could repel the blow. The battle continued in the house on the hill. After catching his brother's body, Nagyon saw that there was a severe wound in Nagyon's back and was frightened. The hood fell off the stranger's head. He didn't understand why Nagyon had chosen defense over attack in the middle of the battle. Nagyon's brother asked him why he did it, hoping Jin would answer, but he knew the answer was because of him. The brothers fell to their knees before the stranger. He stood with a sword in his hand and offered to kill the other one, but his colleague replied that they were family. The executioner stuck his weapon in the ground and told Nagyon that he was giving him a chance. He only needed to kill Najin, in which case he would keep him alive. Jin didn't understand how he could do that. They were twins and had always been very friendly. He remembered them laughing together about something. When they were younger, Nagyon was stronger, and if his brother was hurt, he would run to help. Jin apologized for it, but Kyung said he would always protect him. Kneeling, he held his brother, whose back was pierced by a sword. His head rested on his shoulder and blood dripped from his mouth. All that was left was family. He pulled the sword from his brother's back and threw it to the ground. He thought about the fact that there was a secret that no one knew about. Nagyon stood looking at his hands. His eyes said he was terrified. He looked at his brother's body and thought that he was actually the one who had massacred his brother. The executioner still stood near them. Nagyon reached for the hilt of his sword as he listened to the orders to kill his brother and keep him alive. Grabbing his sword and rising from his knees, he prepared to strike. Furious, he shouted with all his might for them to attack. He would fight to the last man. His enemy clenched his fist and stood up to begin his attack. He began to attack his assailant, shouting to his brother with all his might. For Najin to bear with him, he would try to hold them off while help went to them. Suddenly, Najin stood up, barely leaning on his knee. He took hold of his brother's hands to stop him. He said quietly that there was no chance of victory. Najin pointed the sword at his own chest and pressed down, saying before he did so that the two of them could not die together. Najin stood there, holding the sword in utter bewilderment. He looked at the weapon his bloody hands held, and his brother's hands were already falling from the hilt. He said his brother's name quietly. Putting his hand on his brother's face, Najin wanted to say something, but he didn't have the strength. Nagyon froze like a stumbling block. Najin's body softened as life was leaving him. He fell with a rustle at Nagyon's feet. The strangers left them. They walked, their black robes fluttering in the wind. They thought they had extinguished Udion's fire. Standing amidst the flames that blazed, Nagyon lowered his hands and bowed his head. Looking at his brother's body that lay face down on the floor, he wondered why this had happened. Tears streamed down his cheeks at the realization that his brother was dead. It was the only thing he had left, his family. Picking up his sword from the floor with his other hand, he gathered his hair into a ponytail and cut off his golden locks with a sharp blade. He pulled his hair back with a black ribbon, just like his brother's, and decided that today was the day Nagyon died for everyone. Standing with the sword in his hand and looking at his brother, he spoke Jin's name and added that he would borrow it. It was getting dusk outside. Nagyon stood near the ruins of the burned house and remembered the men in robes. How many were there? 5 or more? No matter, he was determined to avenge Najin. His hand reached for the sword stuck in the ground, and he gripped the hilt tightly. He decided he would live his brother's life, and then they would come back for him. He remembered the man who stood in the center. He wore a mask with a diamond engraved in the center, so he knew Najin. Nagyon turned around to leave, and suddenly, a black figure peeked out from behind a tree and said, "What a waste." His eyes went wide. Fadian stood before him with her hands folded and said that what had happened was a significant loss to them. Looking at her with disdain, Nagyon thought how she might not even express sympathy. He decided to clarify what she meant. She cheerfully continued to voice her train of thought and explained that many thought Nagyon was weak, but she saw great potential in him. Looking at him, she added that she had been waiting for Nagyon to prove himself, so she was sorry to lose such a person. He stared at her with a furrowed brow, wondering what she was trying to tell him. Remembering the masked stranger and the blue eyes that hid beneath it, he thought, what if it was her? The girl leaned toward him, tucking her blonde hair behind her ear, and upon seeing the weapon in his hand, asked him where he had obtained such a beautiful sword. Glancing at him with her foxy eyes, she suggested with a chuckle whether he had bought it. Looking into her eyes, he said he'd gotten it but didn't finish, as he thought about what she was doing. Cooking it. Fadian watched and smiled. Her blue eyes peered out from beneath snow-white lashes and pierced him. She was a powerful woman. Imagining that she was an enemy, he realized that even Najin couldn't handle her. He asked her why she had come, not to ask him questions. She laughed and explained that she had come because she had something to say. He closed his eyes and thought how strange she was strange after all. He wanted to tell her if she wanted to make a joke, but she interrupted him before he could finish. She hugged him, resting her head on his shoulder, and said, "Good job, Nagyun." Worried, he thought she was a knight and knew everything from the beginning, or that she had him figured out. Maybe she's testing him. He said he was just pretending to be his brother. They are twin brothers and he can fool anyone. Now he's Najin, he continued to say. His words made Fadian laugh so hard that she even bent with laughter. Nagyon looked at her with a serious expression. Putting his hand on Nagyon's cheek, he said that they did look alike, especially with his blank, expressionless gaze. Continuing to look just as slyly, she added that he needed to be as energetic as Nagyon, or he would not expect an adequate response to his actions. He's angry that she's acting weird because she already knows he's Nagyon. He doesn't understand what's driving her. But she leaned down to his ear and smiled, whispering, "Relax." Nagyon was startled, his eyes wide open. Covering his lips with her fingers, she said he was being ridiculous. Nagyon froze, waiting to see what would happen next. Firmly grasping his face so that his mouth was closed, she gave him the advice not to necessarily become Najin. And so, unclasping her fingers, she threw him a "see you tomorrow" and waved goodbye. Najin remained standing in the same spot, looking in the direction from which Fadian had just been, and from where she had disappeared with a pop. He leaned on his arm and began to ponder. Whether she had given the advice in good faith or not, he couldn't say for sure. For now, revenge is all that matters. Behind Fadian's back stood the boys, their faces sullen. She cheerfully shouted good morning to them and reminded them that today was exam day. Rujian was nervous that the teacher was too excited. Thar added that he was anxious too. Najin stood a silent statue behind them. The teacher started breaking the floor and yelling that it would be great if they answered her. She raised her index finger up and began to explain. Those who passed the exam would become the knight's apprentice. With a stern look, she added that the most important thing was that during the exam, their lives could be cut short. The guys looked at her, and drops of sweat appeared on their faces. She asked if anyone wanted to refuse, but they didn't say anything. With a cheerful shout, Fadian said that the exam would start now and pointed her finger forward. Someone appeared behind the students. They turned around to see who it was. In front of them stood a girl with a carriage and a skirt, holding an umbrella in her hand. She said, "Ms. Knight Grey Fox Rudica has arrived for the exam." Fadian called her a crybaby and asked her why she was interrupting her. The girl cried and bowed her head, saying she hadn't asked to be called that. Fadian sharply threw her back so that she would stop crying. Amidst the girls' bickering, Rujian and Roos began to discuss the upcoming exam. Roos decided that they would be evaluating spirit power, which meant that Najin would take first place. Najin looked at all the laughing guys discussing the exam. Fadian reprimanded a crying girl and wondered if any of them could be his brother's killer. Raojun turned around to Najin to see if he was okay. Frightened by the words addressed to him, he began to stammer and ask if he looked different. The green eyes continued to pierce his gaze, but Raojun said he just seemed lost, and maybe it was due to overexertion. Nagyun exhaled and closed his eyes in relief, reassuring his friend that it wasn't, and thanked her for her concern. Suddenly, a hand went up with a question addressed to the teacher, which interrupted the general noise. It was Rujian who asked Madame to elaborate on the exam and timidly lowered his hand. Holding a crying Rudica by the cheek, Fadian turned to the students. Fadian replied with a smile that the students were anxious to get started. Standing up like soldiers in a line and in a united voice, the boys answered, "No way, no." With her hands at her sides, the mentor said it was important that she tell her role first. She would be a caretaker. Putting her index finger up, she cheerfully added that it was her job to make sure the examiner didn't accidentally massacre anyone. Rujian glanced at Thar, hoping he had misheard, but Thar remained silent. The teacher continued to say their task was to defeat the knight. Rudica walked to the center of the hall and slammed her umbrella to the floor. Everyone turned to her. She asked which one of them would go first. Behind her back, Fadian was still as cheerful and said they'd better focus, because Rudica had no reason to feel sorry for them. She was stronger than her. Suddenly, Rudica stood up as if preparing for a fight, her umbrella extended in front of her. Her hair fluttered to and fro. The boys were wary and eyed her warily. Najin looked warily at his rival. Even 10 students can't defeat one knight, and the teacher wants them to beat one of them, Najin thought to himself. He remembered the magazine picture that said Najin was the most promising candidate. This exam is critical to him. He thought that if he passed, the criminals who killed his brother would know he was alive. That would be the first step toward revenge. Tears rolled from Rudica's amber eyes. She looked up and held out her hand. She held Tara above her, grabbing him by the throat. Ruth was lying on the floor, Rujian squatting on the floor, Raojun and Najin standing with swords scattered around them. She unclenched her hand, and Tar fell to the floor. Turning to Najin, she asked if he wanted to make an attempt. Standing still, he looked at her and quietly said, "No." Happy with the answer, Fadian announced with an essential look that the first part of the exam was over. They walked down the street, all exhausted from the battle with the knight and covered in abrasions. Russ was even drooling from his mouth. Suddenly, Rujin stopped abruptly ahead of the advancing column and looked toward Najin and Rao Jun. Looking sternly back, Najin frowned his eyebrows, and Rao Jun was wary and leaned forward slightly. Rujin came close to Najin's face. He didn't take a step back in response and stared back just as stubbornly. "Why did you stand and stare again?" asked Rujin angrily. She thought it was his way of winning, and he obviously knew what her weaknesses were. Lowering his head, Najin frowned, saying he didn't know, but suddenly decided to rectify the situation. Looking just as angry, he offered to ambush the knight to improve their chances. Unsure of the plan's solidity, Tar clarified whether Jin was serious about suggesting it. Looking sternly at his mate, Tar reminded him that they were the ones who wanted to become knights, and if he was going to break the rules, he would stop him. Looking at Tara, Rujin said he was right, and that the rules should be followed. He proposed a plan that if they joined forces, they could win. Round 2. They surrounded Rutika as if preparing to jump. She was still wielding her umbrella. Rujin bent down on his knees and, holding his sword in his hand, advised Taru to take his time. Deciding that the operation was about to start, they rushed to attack the knight from both sides. Having pinpointed his target, Tar confidently tried to grab the umbrella to disarm his opponent. But the knight kicked him in the face with all her might, leaving the weapon to him. Clenching her teeth, Rujin prepared to strike and clenched her hand into a fist. But suddenly, Rutika was already behind him, and hooking the handle of the umbrella around her throat, she threw Rujin back into the wall. Blood spurted from her mouth, and her body slammed against the wall. She thought she had a little more left, remembering what they had come up with. She and Tar decided to take the brunt of it. They wanted to disarm her so she couldn't use the umbrella. But first, we need to figure out what it's for. With all his might, he shouted there was a little more left and ordered an attack. Behind the knight, Tar and Russ, who was clutching his sword tightly in his hand, were preparing to attack. The knight saw them from the side and thought about what they were up to. A second attempt is made by Thar to grab an umbrella and disarm his opponent. Abruptly, the umbrella swings open right in front of Tara's face, and he stops. She was able to deflect Russ's blow, and he flew back to the wall. Meanwhile, Rutika aimed to deflect Tara's attack and turned towards him. Extending her arm with the umbrella forward, she punched Tara in the stomach, and he ricocheted to the side. Rujin in the background screamed now. With all his might, Thar clutched the umbrella with his hands and braked to keep from flying away. He called to Najin for help. The knight finally realized why Najin was not participating in the battle, but it was already too late. She had been struck. The umbrella opened, and behind it stood Najin. The knight was surprised that they understood their majority and had prepared a decoy for her. Her eyes widened in horror as she knew she was about to be dealt a decisive blow. In front of her stood Raojun, drawing his sword and preparing to attack. She opened her umbrella and hid behind it, hoping to deflect the blow. Did they really think she was that bad? Her blue hair fluttered over her head. She looked at the students in anticipation. Looking at the black figure in front of him, Raojun clenched the hilt and swung his sword. She looked to the side and saw Najin. How can a rising star stand aside? Jin bowed his head and thought about how cold the room was. A white light enveloped the room. Rutika was furious and wanted to strike a decisive blow, but suddenly, a voice stopped her. Placing a hand on the knight's shoulder, Fadian said that was enough for today. Rutika nodded to show that she agreed with the decision. Round 2 is over. The 5 of them remained in the empty room, surrounding the spot where the knights had just been. Standing leaning on the floor, Rujin was furious. Clenching her teeth, she said a curse. Standing in front of the boys, Najin said he understood, and everyone turned to look at him. He understood how to defeat the knight. Fujian shouted across the room, asking how come. Najin stood stone-faced. While Rujin was screaming, she had her hand over her mouth to make her stop. Releasing his hand, Najin said he couldn't give details, but they would win if they listened to him. Round 3. They are once again standing in the middle of the room across from the knight. Sitting on a high rock to observe the situation, Fadian said that today was the last day. The knight stood still with a frown. Raising his hand, Najin clarified if he could say anything before they began. Looking at him, the knight squinted her eyes and said she was allowing him to speak. He asked what the intent of this exam was, and recalled that the first time they met, Rutika had asked which one of them would go first. Listening carefully to Gina's words, Fadian smiled, looking at him. Continuing the speech, he said they needed to defeat the knight, not fight him, which was how he decided to show superiority over him. They all stood ready for battle. Najin finished his speech by saying that they would surpass the knight in battle. It was obvious from the knight's face that she didn't understand where they were going with this. Fadian's eyes went wide as she wondered what they were up to. When she looked at Rutika, She thought she was angry because people are often driven by anger. A tear rolled down Rudika's cheek, and she agreed with Najin. In her mind, she wondered if they really thought they could defeat her in a fight. Rudik's vixen was disbanded from the advanced group of knights. She stood in a stance ready to attack. Rujian was in command. She shouted for everyone to get ready and not to stand. The knight went on the offensive, holding her weapon, a maroon umbrella. Rujian warned the boys. Suddenly, the umbrella opened wide and was behind her back. She held it like a parachute. The guys were horrified at what they saw, their eyes wide open, and Ruth even wanted to cover himself with his hand. She swung her umbrella and watched what happened next. With a shockwave, the students scattered in different directions. The bright light blinded them, and Rujian couldn't open her eyes. When Rujian opened her eyes, she wondered where the knight was, but she was already standing behind her. She struck from the back. Rujian no longer believed they could defeat such a monster. Before the exam, Najin stands and tells them what they need to do. Looking at him, Tar clarifies you want to use the same move twice. Rujian also looked questioningly at him. He thought it would work. Reminding the boys of what happened in the fight, he says that she stopped attacking them for a while, which means that Raojun's powers are having an effect on her. Accordingly, they need Raojun to strike her, and so he does. But she reflects it back with her dedicated weapon, and the Raojun rebounds, flying into the wall. Deciding to advance, Najin accelerated. The knight was already half-turned toward him. She looked at him with her amber eyes, but her gaze had no effect on him. She clutched the umbrella tightly, thinking that she had been vigilant against him, but he was not afraid of her. She overestimated his abilities. Determined to test what Najin was capable of, she launched a devastating attack. And if Najin could withstand this attack, it was deadly for Nagyon. So the only one who knew Nagyon was impersonating his brother interrupted Rudike. Fadian stepped between them, pushing Najin away and grabbing the umbrella. She wondered if Nagyon was using her. There was nothing left for her. Nagyon knew that the teacher would be forced to intervene on his behalf because he was still weak. An altercation started between the knight and the teacher. Najin was flying backward at this time. Rudika didn't understand why Fadian was protecting him. Snatching the umbrella out of Fadian's hand, she pointed it again at Najin, saying she wanted to see what he was free to do. But she was knocked back by a swinging kick from Fadian's leg. A fight broke out between them. Rudika looked at Fadian in shock, not understanding what was wrong with her and why she was protecting Najin. Coughing, Fadian scratched the back of her head, looked at Nagyon, and said it was a secret. Rudika was still looking at Fadian with the same frown. A crease appeared on the bridge of her nose as she shifted her eyebrows. Deciding to explain that the children's strategy was to get the knight to fight not only against them, but against her as well. That's how Fadian summarized it. She raised her index finger with a bright look and said, "If you negligently treat the lives of students you don't know what will happen, and it's just an exam." She pointed her finger at Rudy and asked her to admit defeat. Rudika stood with her mouth open and her hands down, listening to what she was being told. She disagreed. Turning away and gritting her teeth, she opened her eyes wide, and they were full of anger. Smiling sweetly, Fadian stood, pretending everything was fine, with Rujian hiding behind her back. Rudy, crying, blamed Fadian for always hitting her for no reason and protecting them. The other one tried to calm her down. The shocked students stood and silently watched the picture that unfolded before their eyes. 30 minutes later, Rudika stood before them with a sad face and congratulated them on becoming a knight's apprentice. The disciples stood and looked at each other happily. Behind them, Najin stood with a nonchalant face. Rudika turned to him and asked him if he had changed anything since he was a rising star. He looked her in the eye and said nothing. Finishing her speech, she said that they were either trying to become worthy of the title or they would get it because they were deserving, and ordered them to follow. Standing outside among the trees, he greeted the dawn, holding his sword. With a swing, he cut through the tree in front of him with his sword blade, and then the second. Looking back at the stumps that remained in the ground, he realized he still had a long way to go before he reached Najin. Looking at the students standing in front of her, Rudika asked if they knew what class they were in. With a lost face, Rujian stammered and assumed it was in 274, but no. Explaining that they now have a second special class, she stated that due to the hostilities in the East, a special training program was established. Continuing to explain to the students what was in store for them, Rudika said that the duty also included being a member of the night platoon. Immediately, Nagyan remembered Fadian's words that he might die, and she realized what he meant. Standing in formation, the students listened to the orders of their task to find Rudika before she left. She would be leaving the village in a month. They were given a month to prepare their weapons. Standing in front of the enormous tree and looking at the sword sticking out of it, Nagyan sighed. He was in a forest of giant trees and their stumps. The sword was sticking out of the barrel. Nagyun rubbed his wrists in front of him and realized that it was a matter of his abilities that things wouldn't come as easily as they did in the exam. Taking the sword in his hands, he exhaled and decided that he needed more training. He couldn't reach Nagyun's level in a short period, but he could improve. 2 weeks later, Nagyun breathed steam in the cold air. Sweat poured off him like a river. Standing in front of the mangled, bladed tree with a sword in hand, he thought it strange that his skills weren't improving. 10 years ago, long before the fire in the village, at night, sounds were coming from a house in the middle of the forest. Tears flowed down Nagyun's cheeks that day as he looked at a crying Nagyun and promised to protect him. Lying on the bed, Nagyun looked up at the ceiling. After a few hard days, he had come to his senses after all. He got up and sat on the bed, leaning on one arm. He looked out the window. By now, Nagyun was standing with sword in hand against the stumps of what was left of the entire forest. The black ribbon that tied his tail swayed in the wind. He had become a completely different person. Nagyun laughed and asked his brother if he was all right. He no longer needed Nagyun's protection, thinking that since he and Nagyun were blood brothers, he could become stronger for him. And now Nagyun is still standing in front of the tree. He tried to cut down with his sword but failed. That's not what happened. Sweat rolled down Nagyun's face as he exhaled steam, and he thought he hadn't gotten any stronger, not even a little. It had been 2 weeks, and nothing had changed. He opened his eyes wide and wondered if he didn't have any talent. In fact, he did. Nagyun had no predisposition for fighting. To understand what this is all about, we must start with Nagyun. He was a man of incredible abilities, comparable to a diamond. It was the opposite of Nagyun. He could only be compared to a piece of stone, so incapable was he of being a boy. He often thought back to the words of his brother, who claimed he just needed a little more practice. Opposite a huge rock stands Nagyun. It is said that the ability can manifest itself in times of crisis. While warming up, he remembered reading about a man who had awakened to powers while trying to be thrown off a cliff. With trembling hands, he climbed the rock. As he grabbed one rock after another, it was hard for him to breathe. After traveling less than a meter, he decided to give up and climb down. He leaned over the ground and remembered his childhood. He didn't understand how others could become so strong, even though he used to be the one who could wipe the floor with them. Now, they all have some skills in the end, especially Raojun. Even though he had attended the night training class every once in a while, deciding that Raojun must have attended a secret training session, Nagyun hid behind a tree and watched Raojun practice. But Raojun noticed that he was being watched and turned to the tree, but there was no one there. Hiding sharply behind a tree that was twice as big as Nagyun, he thought how careful Raojun was. When Raojun realized that his pursuer was still watching him, he decided to flee. Nagyun tried to catch up with him but couldn't. He stopped in the middle of the forest and leaned on his knees. He was shaking. He didn't realize if the rock was the way out. Remembering the direction in which Raojun had gone, Nagyun went to the same place and hid behind a tree. He saw Raojun standing on the cliff in front of the waterfall. Raojun held a sword, and Nagyun wondered if this was really the weapon he had chosen. Swinging his sword, Raojun struck the water falling from the mountain. Thinking that the battle with the waterfall was nonsense and unlikely to help him in any way, Nagyun went back into the forest. Stopping near one of the trees, Nagyun paused. He heard some voices. In the middle of the forest stood those strangers in robes and masks who had paid them a visit at their parents' home. Nagyun moved toward them, but a branch crunched under his feet, and the crowd of manic strangers turned toward Nagyun, noticing him. As he looked at his opponents, Nagyun's mind wondered if they had come to kill him, and he remembered that he hadn't brought a weapon. Looking into the eyes that hid beneath the mask, Nagyun realized that it was over and was sure that he might die today. Standing in the middle of the trees, Nagyun lowered his head and wondered what he should do. His thoughts were jumbled, and he even asked if he should reveal himself. The enemy shouted insults in his face, thinking he was Najin. Nagyun came to his senses from that shout. Their leader ordered silence with a 2-fingered thumbs up. Nagyun immediately turned his attention to the man in the engraved mask. Realizing he was in a predicament, Nagyun stood up and clenched his fists. He remembered the conversation the strangers were having. Maybe they were discussing something important. The solution Nagyun came to was calculated silence and a sly smirk. Watching him smirk, the opponents came to shock. They were clearly expecting something else. While they were coming to their senses, Nagyun decided not to hesitate and took off. They only saw his heels disappear behind a tree. The stranger who had shouted the insults jerked out of his seat to chase after the escapee, but their leader stopped him again with a motion of his hand. The subordinate became indignant because he was sure they could catch up with him, especially since the boy had heard their conversation. But the leader ordered him to calm down. The leader was sure it was a trap. The Fire Knight had a keen sense of intuition. They decided to rely on intuition, thinking it was the best way out of the situation. As he ran as fast as he could, Nagyun looked around to see if he was being chased. He just hinted that he was going to trap them, but he played the part very confidently. Nagyun realized something. His weapon was not a sword, as he had thought, but something he had not noticed before. In his thoughtfulness, he didn't notice the obstacle in front of him and flew backward. He immediately rose quickly back to his feet, wondering if he had been caught up. But when he got up, he saw Raojun standing in front of him with his hand on his chest, apparently frightened. The village was already visible behind him. Raojun started asking where Nagyun was going and what he was doing there. He breathed out a sigh of relief that it was Raojun and not someone else, and coughed as he thought about how to justify himself. Suddenly, he had the crazy idea that maybe Raojun was in on it with them. He glared at Raojun and theorized that he might have taken off his mask to extract information from him. Raojun asked if Najin was all right. Raojun didn't know what was going on, but continued to speak to Najin. Jin waited to see what he would ask. A voice came from somewhere and interrupted the boys. The girl said, "I finally found you." Nagyun and Raojun turned around. They saw a panting Rujian who rested her palms on her knees to catch her breath. She said, "Trouble." She started shouting that the Fox Knight had escaped. The boys were shocked by this news. In the village streets, the day was in full swing as the sun enveloped the houses with its warmth. Fadian laughed at the students because they believed Rudika's words that she would be in the settlement for a month. Rujian screamed hysterically about how it was possible not to believe it, since the knight herself had said so. Taken aback, Tar said there was no choice, and we had to act now. The boys rushed on their way. Fadian only had time to ask, shouting after them if they had taken their weapons and received a positive answer. The team stood armed and staring at something in front of them. They were ready to fight. The Fire Knight spoke to his subordinate about how everything would be fine. However, the latter kept thinking about Najin escaping and believed that if there hadn't been a trap, they would have caught him. With a stern look, the knight said, "What's done is done," and turned away. Looking at something, Raojun reached out and informed everyone that he had found the knight's trail. Bending down, he stood over the trail. Rujian praised him and beckoned him over. Thar stood beside him, and they marched in a column deep into the forest, leaving the village behind them. Fujian was pleased to find footprints and decided that the knight had simply been in a hurry. Ruth covered his face with his hand, as if he were a detective looking around. Najin looked at her sarcastically, asking if she really thought so. Rujian turned around questioningly. Najin asked if she really thought the knight had left the footprints by accident, and was told why not. Looking at Rujian, he emphasized that Rudika was actually a knight. Najin stopped and said that there was no guarantee that they wouldn't be ambushed. He was afraid of getting screwed in the beginning. Rujian frowned her eyebrows, and Tar said that the knight might have intentionally left marks. Najin interjected and reminded them that the knight was going to leave them in a month. All stopped in the middle of the forest, they thought. Not realizing where this was going, Najin Raojun asked if it wasn't evidence, then what was it? Turning around, Najin explained that it was a clue and they could probably find it. Thinking he was mocking her, Rujian screamed. One clue at a time, the next clue at a time, and she was getting confused. Holding the hilt of his sword, Najin calmly said that it was just his guess, and the best solution for them was not to rely on chance, but to be vigilant. Raojun began to think that if they found the clue on the east side of the village, they would be able to figure out which way the knight had gone. Pensively bringing a hand to his chin, Tar also remembered the knight's words about her being sent to them. He figured since she was sent to the northern region, she could be either east or south. Rujian screamed that there was still a west. Realizing that the exams were conducted by region, Raojun decided that the destination would be the point where the continents meet, i.e., the center of the continent. Remembering the city standing on the hill, Najin realized it would be the capital. Realizing they couldn't trust their judgment yet, they decided to move in that direction. At night, they built a fire, and sitting by the fire, each placed his weapon beside it. Russ was already asleep when Tar concluded that there were no more clues in this place. Fujian whined because she was tired, but Raojun was cheered up by the fact that thanks to Najin, they were making some progress. Rujian chewed something and said they weren't getting close anyway. Still, Najin interrupted her because it wasn't time to think about it yet. He offered to tell each other about the guns, but fellow students looked at him strangely, clarifying why they should. Najin said that this way, they would better understand how to act in a critical moment and, in general, learn more about each other. He thought it was a good decision. Raojun decided he would start first. He took out a sword and said he named it Libra. The sword is one-handed and lacks any notable features, yet it is powerful. Ruth continued to speak. Picking up the axe from the ground, he said its name was Gemini. It was double-edged, and sparks came from it when it struck hard surfaces. Thar held a thin dagger in his hand, saying that once a day he could emit accumulated daylight, but he didn't have a name. Rujin said she, too, has a sword without any features, but it's a family heirloom, and no one can match it in sharpness. Its name is Light. They turned to Nagyon, who was sitting with his hands on the ground and leaning back, and asked what about him. He closed his eyes. Putting her sword back in its sheath, Rujin repeated his name, but he said he had something to tell them first. Continuing his speech, he said he was sure they had noticed he wasn't the same, and added that he trusted them, which is why he decided to share. The light of the fire fell on the faces of his friends. They looked at him questioningly. He finished by saying that he was no longer able to fight. He then decided to justify himself by saying that maybe it was a psychological problem after what had happened. Everything Nagyun said was bait. After all, he wasn't just going to be Najin, he was going to be the Najin who lost his brother. And he cried. His acting was convincing. Raojun reached out sympathetically to ask if everything was all right because so much had happened. He decided that the truth for everyone would be that Najin couldn't fight as he had before. At night, they took turns at the fire. Raojun went to bed, handing over the post to Najin, and asking him to wake them if he heard anything. When everyone was asleep, Najin went deeper into the forest, leaving his sleeping friends by the fire. There was a crunch behind Nagyon's back, and the man asked where he had gone, as it was his turn to be on duty. Making an excuse that he went to see if they had missed the clues, he added that he hadn't intended to go far. The following words took him aback. The man asked if he was Nagyun. Nagyun was glad that he had fallen for his bait. He thought that even if someone suspected something wrong, they wouldn't pick on a man who had recently lost his family. However, if one knows what happened that day, Nagyon's speech will only give him strength. And that man will know that it was Nagyon who survived, not his brother. The bait was to see if the masked man was an acquaintance of Nagyon's. He thought he was the only one who'd fall for his trick. And there before him stood Ruth, smiling stupidly, one hand resting on his side. Could it be that Ruth was the masked man? Nagyon decided not to jump to conclusions, and initially realized how far they were from the camp. Nagyun looked at him and pretended not to know what he was talking about, asking if he had come to mock him. Ruth was taken aback by those words. He explained that, at first, he really believed that Najin was in front of him. That was what he had expected from Nagyon, for he had always been smart. With a stern look in response, Nagyon said he wouldn't stand for it. Is Ruth really a masked man? Russ bent down and pulled some rope out of his pocket, saying that he didn't care whether he was Nagyon or Najin, but that he was very weak right now. And so, he took the axe in his hand, ending his speech by saying that his goal now was to massacre him. In training, Russ was always the first to be taken out, and Nagyon asked how he would do it. Russ swung, injuring Nagyon in the shoulder, and blood spurted out. Nagyon was shocked. Russ was really just pretending to be weak. He asked Najin to stop thinking that he was special, because he was not alone, and warned him that the next blow would be to the neck. Pointing his axe at him, Russ asked if Nagyon had told anyone about what he'd heard in the forest. Saliva ran from Nagyon's mouth as he held onto the wound on his shoulder, realizing that there were two things. The first was that the conversation in the forest was meaningful, and the second is that Russ addressed him as Najin, so he wasn't sure who was in front of him. That means ashes, Nagyon said aloud, and Russ looked at him questioningly. Standing in front of Russ, Nagyon asked if they had said that Udion's fire had gone out, leaving only ashes. But you were wrong, Nagyon finished. He thought about the fact that he's not ash at all. He's coal. He promised Russ that soon he would speed up and make each of them suffer. Armed with axes in both hands, Russ prepared to attack his opponent. But instead of engaging, Nagyon sprinted away. Ruth was taken aback. He called for help from everyone in the camp. The boys got up from their seats, not knowing what was happening. With a stern look in their direction, Raojun asked Nagyon what was wrong. Quickly hiding his weapon behind his back, Russ looked at his fellow students standing around the fire. He thought Nagyon had decided to play with him. He decided to tell them and started yelling that Najin was lying to them and that he was actually Nagyun. He pointed his finger at Nagyon. Everyone looked in their direction, not knowing what was going on. Nagyon shouted for Russ to stop. He went on to say that he was shocked at his brother's attitude, but that was too much. Speaking to everyone, he said that he hoped they would understand because he still couldn't regain his power after losing Nagyon. Tugging at the edge of his clothes, he squinted at Russ and thought that it was too much for him. Sweat broke out on the boys' faces. Nagyon knew women's intuition. Women react correctly to what men cannot see in words and actions. Predictably, Ryujin became enraged, clenched her fists, and hurled obscene insults at Russ. What Nagyon was good at was expressing emotions appropriately. He stood there with his head down sadly, holding onto his sweater as if he were hugging himself. At that moment, Russ realized that the ability to fool everyone and to gain people's trust was Nagyon's weapon. Ruth stood behind everyone and looked out at the crowd of people gathered around something, or someone. Nagyon was standing in the middle of the crowd, and everyone was anxiously asking if he was all right. Did he turn out to be Nagyon? But the masked man confidently said it was Nagyon. The strangers were talking. One of them said that they had seen with their own eyes that Nagyon was dead, but the other one tilted his head uncertainly and said that he thought it was Nagyon. They stood opposite each other, and their leader reminded the doubter that he had said he could clearly distinguish between Nagyon and Nagyin. I asked him to believe what he said last week, or what he's saying now. He also explained that Nagyon is pretending due to circumstances. Looking sternly at his subordinates, he said that, for sure, they couldn't know who it was. But in any case, Nagyon was a child of fire and was ordered to keep a watch on him. Eyes wide open, Nagyon looked at the crowd of familiar silhouettes among the trees. At this moment, Russ was confused when he saw Nagyon, but he was able to keep a low profile to avoid giving himself away. So he started shouting insults at the boy, and Nagyon began to suspect something. The man under the rhombus mask was much closer. Nagyon thought if he was wrong, let Ruth speak up. But that's how Ruth fell into his own trap. Clenching her fists, Ryujin shouted to Russ that this was too much and asked what he was doing. Angry, Russ wondered where to start and whether to deny everything. With his head bowed and his eyes closed, he didn't know how to justify his behavior because no matter what he said, they would be on his side. So he just decided to throw himself at Nagyon with his axe. But his attack was blocked. Ryujin managed to deflect the axe blade with his sword. Russ only clucked his tongue. Drawing her sword, Ryujin shouted for Russ to leave. Tar hid his hand behind his back and asked if Russ was going to fight. Standing and looking at Russ, Ryujin wondered if he had always been this fast. Covering his face with his hand, Ryujin said that even though he wasn't experienced in battles yet, he was trying his best. He leaned over, swinging his sword, and warned his opponent that if he was going to fight, he would suffer greatly at his hands. Tucking his weapon behind his back, Russ said, "Okay," but he didn't choose to surrender. Suddenly, he pulled out a sharp, thin dagger that belonged to Tar. Enraged, Tax shouted that it was his dagger. Ryujin stood with a frown, and Russ hurled insults at them before saying goodbye. A bright, white light illuminated the forest, blinding everyone around them. Ruth disappeared. A dagger was stuck in the ground where Ruth had been standing before. Thar walked over and took it. The next day, the boys were on the road again. They walked through the forest, determined to continue the mission without him. Ryujin called out to Najin, and she turned to him. She asked if he was okay, and he said he was. She timidly told him to hang on. She overtook him by going a little ahead of him. Nagyon looked at her and thought that she had mocked him before. And the whole gang that's been together all this time is falling apart. He was beaten up by Ruth for fun, and everyone thought he was weak, but it was just to his advantage to stay in the company. For some reason, Tar didn't do anything to him, standing quietly with the bullies, but never bothering him. Fujian hated him. She was always annoying, though Nagyon didn't think she was so bad. Maybe Nagyon even understands her because she just needed to vent her anger. 10 years ago, there was a massive fire that killed her only family member. It was her father. The real cause of the fire was Nagyun. But Ryujin wasn't angry at him for causing the fire. She was furious at herself because she couldn't protect him. Meanwhile, from the coast of the eastern continent, someone docked at the shore and stepped out of the boat. It was a man wearing a skeleton mask and a tall black hat. He was holding a weapon. Something sinister was approaching. Stopping in the middle of the rocks somewhere on the hill, the team decided to search the area for a bit and then move on. Nagyun held up a finger to indicate that they needed to take more territory, so they'd better split up. But if anyone heard anything, let them shout. Ryujin came up with the motivation for the search by suggesting that if anyone found anything, they would be exempt from the night watch. Leaving Nagyun alone, the boys scattered to look for any clues. Nagyun turned around and sat down on the rocky outcropping. He thought he should rest for an hour because chasing the night was not easy. He's even glad he's up against Ruth. He has a bad temper and has never gotten good grades. Maybe Ruth isn't the only one undercover. Maybe one of those three is also a member of that organization. Remembering how the masked man had pointed out which of the two of them was Najin back at the house, he decided it was unlikely that anyone else was involved. In fact, he thought his biggest problem was himself. Ruth was stronger than he thought, and he was a weakling. Even though his stamina had improved in a few days, there was still a big difference between him and the guys. It's his eyesight that's the problem. Even though he has a keen eye, He could barely catch the boys' movements. He felt he had to bridge the gap between him and the boys, and to do that, he had to try to buy time. Stopping among the trees, Rus caught his breath, thinking that he had failed, and said out loud that he had learned something. A dark figure peeked out from behind a tree and asked to tell him everything. The man in the diamond mask asked if Rus was sure it was Nagyon. Ross replied that he didn't doubt it, adding that Nagyon had confessed it to him himself. Begging for Nagyon to be dealt with now, Russ reasoned that there were no knights in the settlement now, only apprentices. The supervisor replied that you can't attack now because he's there and it's dangerous for them. Ruth didn't realize what he was saying and asked again. The man replied that the boy could hear their plan, and it had to be eliminated. He decided that if Nagyon had overheard them, he obviously didn't understand anything, so it was best to leave him in the background. That's what they think, so Nagyon decided to give him the time to get stronger and focus on training. Leaning against the rocks, he stood up, thinking that while he was developing physically, he would be under the knight's care the entire time, which was convenient. There was a shout and footsteps. Rujian was glad to be the first to arrive, but when she saw Nagyon, she was disappointed that he had arrived faster than she had. Once everyone was together, Nagyon ordered a report, and Raujin said he found nothing. However, Rujian extended her hand and shouted that she had an objection. Nagyon calmly said he would listen to her after everyone had reported the situation. Still, Rujian said she was just against it. She shouted that she didn't want to report to him because he wasn't elected to lead, but Raujun countered that Nagyon was the smartest one here. With a cluck of her tongue, Rujian grinned. Tar asked if they were going to broach the subject, and if so, he'd get some sleep. Deciding that Rujian's words made sense, Nagyun offered to give the leadership to her. A little embarrassed, Rujian looked in his direction and asked if he really thought so. Offering to tell the first thing she found, Rujun heard that she didn't have anything either, and he didn't understand why she was still reporting to Najin. Nagyon was sure that Thar had found something and turned to him. Thar replied that he had nothing special, just a small village nearby. Tyr didn't understand how Najin realized that he was the one who had found it. Still, Nagyon had already suggested that Rujian go there, and she had agreed. As they approached the village, they saw that it was all ruined. Rujian wondered how long the place had been abandoned. Nagyon suggested we split up and explore the place. We should look around, but not take any action. Agreeing, Tar and Raujun went in one direction, saying they would see them later. There were still axes stuck in the doors and arrows lying around, and Rujian summarized that the place looked like a dump. Suddenly, there was a crunching sound behind them, and Rujian swiftly drew her sword, turning toward the source of the sound. Their eyes widened at the sound. In front of them stood a girl with pink hair, her face marred by abrasions and tattered clothes. She asked them for help. She started to say something about the people in the village, but then fainted and began to fall. Rujian picked her up, asking what was wrong. She yelled for the girl to come to her senses. Najin, at this time, said that the village had been attacked, and from the looks of it, it wasn't that long ago. Rujian was enraged. She didn't understand who could have done such a thing. After whispering for them to save the people, the stranger passed out, and a voice in the distance called out to Najin. Rujian and Nagyon looked over. Pointing his hand somewhere, Rojun shouted that he had found footprints there. It was the footprints of a knight. Rough Jane sat on her knees in front of her, and Raujun stood beside her. Nagyun stepped back to Tar. He asked about the trail, and Tar explained that the trail was very fresh. He thought that if they went immediately, they could catch her. When the girl came to her senses, she began to tell me that their village was a peaceful one, but a few days ago, they were attacked by them. With angry eyes, Rujin asked, what kind of villains did this? Negin didn't understand who the girl was talking about either. The girl said she didn't know. Bandits came out of nowhere and attacked the locals. Nagyon asked what they looked like. Maybe they wore masks. Standing around the girl, they listened. She said that they didn't have masks, but their faces were covered, and they had strange weapons. Thar decided to check if she had seen someone like a girl with blue hair crying and holding an umbrella in her hand. The girl replied that she had never seen such a person, and Tar scratched his chin thoughtfully. Suddenly, the stranger started yelling that one of the 5 of them had said they were apprentices of the knight, so let them help them and save them. And Tar offered to help. But Rujian reminded him that he had said if they followed the knight's trail immediately, they would catch her. Thar began to explain that they had a goal of becoming knights and couldn't just ignore people in need of help. Raojun said that they were really only apprentices, with no guarantee that they would be able to help. The people who attacked easily handled the local soldiers. He decided to remind me what state the village was in and said it was the work of people with good skills. Thar stood with his arms crossed, and Rujian said he was right. If they followed the knight's trail, they could call her for help. They all looked at Najin, asking why he was silent, and asked him to speak on the matter. With a thoughtful hand on his chin, Najin remained silent. He asked, what if they couldn't find the knight? The boys looked at him questioningly. He went on to say that there was a nuance to everything and that suddenly, the people who attacked might be stronger than the knight. There was a lot of doubt in Nagyon's mind. The knight had only been there a short time ago, but she couldn't just walk past something like that. He said that no matter what, he would fight, regardless of how strong his opponents were. He believed that if someone needed help, they should help because that was one of the duties of a knight. And if he can't become a knight, he should die on the way to becoming one. Raojin said he would go in search of the knight. He thought that finding the knight and asking for help was the right thing to do. Thinking about what she would do, Rujin was silent, and everyone turned to Najin, asking what he would do. But what would Najin do if he found himself in such a situation? Nagyun was silent. The girl explained to them that there was a cave in the mountains, and those people were there. Thar found that cave. He turned to Najin, who was holding a sword, and asked if he would be all right. Najin replied that he would be all right, and the two of them went deeper into the cave. The darkness enveloped them, and they disappeared from sight. Watching the boys, the stranger stood in the branches of the tree and was glad they were hooked. The cave was quite spacious, but the boys saw no signs of life. Thar looked around the corner and saw a man sitting on the rocks. He put his finger to his lips to show Najin to be silent. Thar whispered that someone was there. A dark figure with a bandaged face stood between him and Najin, whispering who it was. With a dagger, Thar had already attacked the stranger, but missed. The stranger in the robe was already standing behind him. Najin and Tar turned toward him. The stranger asked if someone had invited them, or if they were uninvited guests. Nagyun thought it wasn't the masked men. Looking toward his opponent, Tar warned Najin that it seemed the stranger's strength was equal to the knight's. The enemy said he wanted Thar's head, and Thar ordered Najin to devise a strategy. While Jun and Rujian search for the knight, they need to stall for time. That was Najin's strategy. Folding his hands behind his back, the stranger asked if they were looking for Gray Fox by any chance, and he pulled the familiar maroon umbrella from behind his back. Najin realized they were in a terrible situation. They split up because Rujian also thought that the best solution for them was to find a knight, and Nagyun and Tar decided to rescue the villagers. Asking them to be careful, Jun and Rujian promised to return as soon as possible. Asking them not to worry, Tar said they would make quick work of it and join them later, and so they stood alone, facing an opponent holding the umbrella of a knight. Rough Jane looked worriedly at the departing boys. Rojun asked what was wrong with her, and she asked if they could handle it. At this time, the situation in the cave was heating up. Jin turned to the enemy, asking if he had attacked the people in the village. Grinning, the man replied, "Yes, and so what?" But Najin had simply set a goal for himself. He was stalling for time, so he continued the dialogue by asking where they were hiding the survivors. Knowing that even though Thar is weaker than Raojun, he has a high level of dexterity, and his weapon can emit a flash, but only once. The opponent began to attack, and Najin had time to warn Tara, who was then able to repel the attack. But the enemy attacked Tara again, and he flew back against the wall. Najin shouted his name. As soon as Tar got up, the stranger attacked him again. Nagyun realized that if Thar got hurt, they had no chance of survival. Deciding that he would rather be hurt with all his speed, Nagyun rushed towards Taru and stood between him and his enemy. A white light came into view. Nagyun didn't realize if he was out or what had happened. Opening his eyes a little wider, he saw Tara fighting his opponent and wondered if he was all right. Thar shouted for Najin to come to his senses. Najin reached up with a shaking hand to his face, thought it was bearable, and realized that he had lost consciousness. When he saw that Thar was standing with a dagger in his hand and it was glowing, he shouted if he would use it. Thar replied that there was no way out. What if there is no flash? Then, they will not be able to overpower the enemy. These thoughts were in Nagyon's mind. The opponent saw that the guys were in trouble and told them not to worry because, in his opinion, they didn't have a chance in the first place. Thar decided to attack and struck his opponent, but he was firm, and a thought flashed through his mind. Scared, Nagyun also thought they might be defeated. The next blow was so decisive that the opponent flew aside. Tar and Nagyun didn't realize what had happened. Rujian apologized and said they had decided to follow them. Behind her stood Raojun with a sword in his hand. He was the one who struck the blow. She said that the knight's trail was gone, and they couldn't fall below the level of the knight's disciples without helping the people who needed their assistance. Now they were all ready to fight, and with their weapons ready, they looked at their enemy. Nagyun said they would give him a hard time. The enemy began to attack. Nagyun shouted for Rujian to block the attack, and she rushed into the battle. She jumped and deflected the blow. Nagyun kept advising her behind her back to keep her guard up because the enemy was as strong as a knight. She didn't notice it, but Nagyun could predict his opponent's next move. He looked at Tara and asked if he was all right, and was told yes. Seeing that his friend's face was covered in abrasions, he asked him not to pretend, and explained that it was also part of the strategy. Determined to tell the truth, Tara explained that his body was actually disobeying him. The following person Nagyun approached was Raojun. Nagyun said that Thar was injured, and the three of them would have to manage. There was a crack. It was one of the rocks on the top that broke off and fell down with a crash. At that moment, the enemy raised his weapon from above and struck, missed. By the time he realized that the guy's goal was a siege, it was too late, and he was in a circle. Deciding that it would be over if he destroyed the commander, the enemy rushed to attack Nagyun. Thar sprang to Nagyun's aid, and his opponent's weapon flew upward, sticking into the stone. The use of large weapons in such spaces might have been a disadvantage. What the enemy will do. Rays of light passed through Tara, and he flew off into the wall, then fell, and the enemy switched to another. Fujian was also struck by the enemy. He chose Raojun next. With decisive blows, he had dealt them all, and then came the last one. Often, people can see through those who lie. However, Nagyun had never shown any signs of lying. A tear rolled down Nagyun's cheek. Looking at the young man, the enemy was surprised. When he felt his aura, the enemy wondered if he was so strong. But it was a lie. In reality, Nagyun wasn't that strong. He was just pretending to be. Only those people who had reached the same level of lying could sense it. Raojun stood behind his opponent, preparing to strike. The enemy grabbed his arm, but Raojun struggled to keep his sword down. Spreading out, he stood next to Nagyun. Nagyun said he wasn't used to this kind of thing at all, and he had reached his limit. The enemy spoke of their strength and determination, reminding him of the old days. Now, he thinks it's a waste to take them out. The exhausted boys listened to his ramblings, which promised them a chance if they joined him. He said he'd count to 3, and they'd have to make a decision. And he said those who refused would die. Not believing that it would end like this, Nagyun heard Rujian say that they had no choice. They were too weak. Just thinking about the fact that she couldn't say those words, he heard her say that despite everything, they should continue. She screamed that if the enemy gave them a choice, their choice was to kill him. Rejoicing at her words, Nagyun rushed into action, and suddenly, he was blinded by the light. When he opened his eyes, he saw the gray fox in front of him, who opened her umbrella wide and pointed it toward the enemy. She turned and looked at them, and Fadian said that they had done a good job, and she couldn't help but recognize it. Rudica was discussing how she could let her win in such an unfair manner. Did they deserve it? Underprepared, they could die. She went to Fadian, and she said that if they didn't meet her standards, they would be expelled immediately. Replying that she had already had similar thoughts, Rudica said she would give them a mock exam, and if she deems someone unworthy, that student will be expelled immediately. Fox said she was disappointed in them. In her opinion, they had done well in the first stage and had almost found her. If they could catch her, that would be the best result. Wondering if she was telling the truth, Nagyun heard that, in fact, she was always there watching them. Putting her hand to her forehead, she continued that in everything else, there had been a lot of disappointment, and their training was just awful. The guys were shocked. Rudica appreciated that their pride and righteousness did not bend to circumstances, for it is the core virtue and most crucial trait of knights. And so, from that moment on, she decided that they would not just be apprentices to the knight, but apprentices she recognized. She also praised Rujian for the speech that was able to raise the morale of her comrades. Tyr was strong in spirit, but he needed to avoid overestimating himself at critical moments and recognize his weaknesses. There were many questions about Nagyun, but Rudica decided to clarify one thing, whether he knew everything from the beginning. And she was right, but why didn't he tell his comrades? Because of competition, or he has a superiority complex? What he says will determine the knight's decision. Blah 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 resounded behind Fox's back. There stood their surviving opponent. The bandages fell to the ground, and it appeared that a young man with blue hair was hiding underneath them. The guys frowned at him, and he continued to say that he was having trouble breathing and that he had to play the villain. It was the Blue Wolf Fedorans. The students had no idea that it was a knight in disguise fighting against them. Standing in front of the students with his arms at his sides, he said they were stronger than he thought. Fox had asked him to do it for her. In the back of the cave, Rudica was talking to Nagyun, away from everyone, and Fedorans wondered what they had gone so far away for. Rujian spoke to their rival, and after confirming he was indeed a blue wolf, said she couldn't understand one thing. Why did he attack the village? She tried to find reasons, but he had done a terrible thing, even though he was a knight. How could he do this to people? Rudica asked where Ruth had gone. The question was directed at Nagyun. He He was silent because the question was very ambiguous, and he couldn't know what she knew, so he decided not to reveal all the information. So he just said he didn't know, and she should have asked Russ. He said that Ruth left voluntarily because of the conflict between them. Since Russ had escaped, he had automatically failed the mission, Rudica thought, and returned to the question of when Najin had found out. But for Nagyon, everything was obvious because in the village, they said that they had killed people. Still, there was no trace of them and the buildings had been destroyed long ago. And the girl's words that one of the 5 had blabbed to her said that she had been waiting for them because when they got there were 4 of them. At that moment, Nagyon thought it was a trap or another exam. That's how he figured it out. Listening attentively, Rudik asked why he hadn't told his comrades everything. The answer was simple. He wasn't sure which of the 2 options awaited them. Rudica's next question. Why did he go to the cave with Tar then? But he just wanted to understand and see for himself. And how did he know it was an exam? It's all about the umbrella. It was proof that she'd seen the man. It was clear there was no fight because both the umbrella and him were fine. He knew how strong she was, and it was impossible to remain completely unharmed after meeting her. Even at that moment, Nagyon was sure that this was a test arranged by the Lady Fox herself. In fact, he was suspicious the moment they met the girl in the village. And after the appearance of the guy with the bandaged face, there was no doubt that he and the girl from the village were together. Though Nagyon was sure of his guess, he didn't say anything, thinking it might help him in his task. Nothing suspicious, but Rudica felt that his words and actions were incompatible. However, her opinion would not seem professional. The most important thing is his strength, and it will likely be enough. After hearing Najin's story, Rudik decided that she didn't like him. Najin was taken aback by such words. She thought such behavior was disgusting, and she couldn't get rid of the thoughts that he was using his comrades. Turning around, she warned him that she would be watching him from now on. Everyone was already standing near the exit of the cave. Rudica said they had to move out. Nagyon followed her. Rujian shouted behind Najin's back, not to be surprised since it was an exam. He sighed. Putting his hands behind his head, Fitterin said he hadn't seen sunlight in so long, but Rudica asked him not to exaggerate. Thar clarified where they were going. Rudica looked back at him over her shoulder. She was going to attach them to 2 other special units. There were unfamiliar voices. One of them was saying it was late and we should hurry. Najin was alert. The following phrase suggested that strangers were in no hurry. Rudica tensed up too. Some people with swords right in front of them jumped up onto tree branches, saying they had been gone too long, so they went towards them themselves. The guy in the mask asked the crybaby to come out faster next time. The other one was indignant because it was the fox's problem why they had to be in such a hurry. Fox clucked her tongue as she looked at them. A whole crowd of people came over. They were all sweating and trying to catch their breath. Frowning her eyebrows, the disgruntled Rujian assumed it was their co-workers. A man with long turquoise hair jumped up to Najin and Raojun. She was so fast, though, that Tar didn't notice much movement. She made a fist with a smile. Suddenly, she held out her hand to a shocked Najin, and smiled and said that they hadn't seen each other in a long time, and he had no idea who she was. The guy in the hat said that the one with the ponytail was Najin, the famous rising star. Another person approached Duran, asking what she thought. She said she didn't even know because she had heard that this guy was going to be a legend. The apprentices from the eastern part of the continent were annoyed to lose to them. From left to right, Quarren Dargan Vadran. The apprentices from the southern part of the continent thought the guys looked weak. Girl Yolnia boy Noljan. Apprentices from the northwestern part of the continent decided there was nothing special about them. Their names were Raymond and Paimel. Apprentices from the southwest part of the continent. They've never seen Martha treat anyone so favorably. Their names are Musa Tarisunjiun. The girl with long turquoise hair, who held out her hand, was named Martha. Nagyun was attracting too much attention. It was problematic for him. It's hard for him to do anything at times like this. He informed Martha that he didn't remember her at all because he had decided to play Najin, the cocky one. The guy behind Martha's back stood up for her, asking how dare he talk to her like that and threatening him with his fist. Martha laughed. Had he forgotten her, and didn't even remember how they both wanted to be knights and make their child the strongest knight of all? Everyone was squinting at Najin. He thought that was news. Rujian shouted that she didn't remember such a thing and that maybe she had made it up. The girl looked hopefully at Najin. She looked at Najin hopefully, but he turned away and asked her, how about being the strongest instead of using someone else? And he walked away, leaving her to stare after him. The guys looked back at him too. Walking over to Martha, Rujian said that Najin always acted this way and patted her comfortingly on the shoulder. Martha sharply pushed Rujian away from her. She was furious and told them not to touch her. Leaving Rujian with a raised hand, Martha turned around and walked in the opposite direction. Can they find common ground? Fitterins asked, but Fox didn't know the answer. The light blue giraffic juice knight wore a hat. He had swamp-colored hair and bright yellow eyes. They have much to learn, but all Gius has to say is just a knight's theory. Around him in the square, the students are crowded. Pointing his finger at Darren and Fox, he said that since those two looked dumb, he would elaborate a bit. The girls asked him to shut up. He asked her to raise her hand if anyone needed to know about this very theory. Rujian wondered if they needed to know. According to Gius, people who are unfamiliar with this theory won't be able to qualify as a knight. Everyone immediately lined up to listen to the story being told. The story of spears and shields is one that I'm sure many have heard before. Once upon a time, there lived an arms dealer. One day, he picked up a spear that could strike down anyone. Then, he raised a shield that could block anything in the world. The man who offered to pierce the shield with his sword was watching him. The merchant had no answer. What did the students think of after hearing the story? And Gius asked Rujian to answer. A little worried, she replied that a knight should not cheat and live a life of doing good. Apprentices from another continent laughed at her answer. Gius asked her what her name was. She answered, and he said her courage was impressive. You can see from this story that even if you have the strongest spear and shield, it means nothing unless you can convince everyone of its value. The theory of knights is that each knight has his own opinion capable of instilling faith in people. Jesus turned to the black-haired guy and asked what ideas he had. He began to stammer. Jesus didn't wait and moved on to the next student. With an abstruse thumbs up, he said that there's nothing special about great power if you're unable to lead people to their own justice. So Gius turned to Najin, standing behind everyone, and asked what he thought. He replied that it seemed more advantageous to be with the shield. The students looked at each other, thinking he was talking nonsense, but the teacher said to continue. Nagyon's thought was that if a shield and a spear are the most potent weapons, then they are made of the same material, and the shield would have an advantage. This was a presentation that Gius had never heard before. He reminded the students that he was asking for their thoughts on the story. The theory of the knight is to voice their own ideas or thoughts without paying attention to the influence of external factors. The students were listening. Were they right to laugh at Rujian, who proudly said what she thought? You can't make fun of someone because your opinion is not the only one. Someone raised a hand up to ask a question. Behind Gius stood a knight in a helmet pulling forward a spear, saying that it too would pierce everything. A knight named Varen asked to stop talking about boring things and proceed to a warm-up match. To assess the students' skills, they will participate in a drill, and the knights will stand and watch them maim each other. It will be a fun spectacle. The man stood, holding a mask with a diamond-engraved design. Slowly, he put it on. Turning to the man whose face was also covered by a mask, he asked if he was ready and received a positive answer. The interlocutor clarified who the leader meant when he said that someone would be there, and therefore it was dangerous. He was talking about Fox. The fox had been following them since Union. She didn't get too close to them, but she didn't get too far away either. The leader stood with his arms folded in front of him. He thought that, besides the fox, there might be other knights, among whom were some very annoying individuals, and they needed to know about them. A girl with pink hair cheerfully pulled forward a glass with chopsticks inside, suggesting that the draw should begin. Rujian shouted upon recognizing the girl, but Rudica explained that she was an employee of the Knight Management Bureau. The girl said she initially got the information that there were 5 of them and didn't know that one of them had escaped, so she made a fatal mistake. Pulling out one of the wands, Rujian saw that it had a red tip and raised it up high, letting everyone know. The stallions are pulled to determine who will fight who. If the color is red, you are fighting someone who also has that color. The second red color fell to Vadran. His friend joked that he was jealous of him and offered to trade. Vadran was sure that he would win. However, Rudica said that there were no winners in this case, and Rujian thought he was an idiot. Thar said that they insulted her, and it should not be allowed. Rujian only just realized what Vadran meant, and she went into a rage, saying she would wipe him out. Ultimately, the distribution was as follows. Rujian was against Vadran. The yellow lot fell to Quarren, and the other part went to Noljin. Orange goes to Najin, who will face off against Yulnya. The Tar Heels with the blue toss found a rival in the form of Martha, who got the second part. Musa was drawn gray, and his opponent was the blue-haired Turisun. 2 handsome, tall brunettes, Ruojun and Daragon, became the next couple. The redheads also stood against each other, Jirun and Paimel. However, there was an odd number of contestants, so Raymond was left without a date. The helmeted knight reached for the lots to determine whose sparring would go first, and the honor fell to the red. The The students under this color were asked to step forward, and Wadran and Raojun took a step out of the column. They stood opposite each other, and the knight noticed that Raojun had no weapons and asked what she would fight with. Confused, Raojun didn't know what to say, but the knight had already given instructions to provide the boys with weapons. Everyone grabbed their weapons and the fight began. Vadran did not wait and rushed to attack. Suddenly, Varen stood between the rivals. Rujin asked what he was doing, and he explained that he could prevent danger if it were to happen. Varen stepped back and gave the command to begin. They attacked each other, and Raojun knew he was strong, but she was sure she could win. Wadran did not spare Raojun. He kicked her with his fists so fast that she did not even have time to answer him. Raojun noticed that Vadran was not using weapons and informed Najin. Clenching his fists, Tar said he was doing it on purpose because he didn't want to end the fight quickly. Looking at Terra Najin, he noticed that he was angry and watching the fight with clenched teeth as if he had seen him for the first time. Folding her arms across her chest, Fadian was telling Rujin that she was not weak and was very worried about her. Strength, speed, and intelligence are not Rujin's specialties, and she needs to focus on her strengths. But Rujin doesn't know what her strengths are. She only knew she didn't want to lose. Ruth opened his mouth wide and yawned. The training was boring for him, so he suggested that Rujin do something. He looked for Nagyan in the crowd and saw him going somewhere. Rus asked Rujin how they were going to make fun of him today. Looking at Nagyan Rujin, she remembered the fire blaze and how she had tried to save her father. He was about to share the idea, but Rujin was already angrily stomping toward Nagyan. Slamming her fist into Nagyan's chest, she leaned over to him and asked why he did it. Ruth stood next to Tar and yawned again, saying that Rujin was at it again and how she couldn't help but get bored. She blamed Nagyan for her father's death and didn't understand why he had done it since his father had never hurt him. Every time she got the same answer, "I don't know." Russ didn't understand why he wouldn't just say the reason why he had to say the same thing every time. He picked at his ear with a finger out of boredom. Holding Nagyan by his clothes, Rujin asked what she had done to him. Nagyan stared back in silence. Blood dripped from Vadran's fist. He was sweating but still holding his weapon as he looked at Rujin. In front of him stood a furious Rujin with her teeth bared. Her hair was disheveled and falling around her face. Darren noticed Rudika leaving and asked where she was going and was told that she could no longer watch Varen enjoy the spectacle. Jesus turned to Varen and asked if it was time to finish, but for Varen, it was just a warm-up match, although he thought the winner could already be chosen. However, Jaius disagreed with Varen, so he ordered the fight to stop. Varen went up to Vadran and announced that he had won. The rivals shook hands, and Wadran said that Rujian shouldn't even hope to become a knight because she was too weak. Rujian caught the hysteria. She thought that with Vadran's level, he wouldn't be able to protect not only his friends, but himself as well. Asking if Rujian was ashamed of becoming such a knight and dishonoring himself, Vadran turned around and walked away. When she was alone, Rujian heard scraps of mockery, like how all the Udion boys were weak and that apparently only Najin had made them famous. It was too much, though Rujian's fellow students didn't think such words could hurt her, especially from strangers. Raojun looked at the girl standing alone and asked how she was. Fujian laughed and asked them to avenge her. With a wave of her hand, she walked past and said she was going to rest. The boys looked at her. Apparently, Rujian is doing well, and Raojun concluded that she has matured. The next lot that was drawn was orange. Najin went up against Yulnya. Everyone was eagerly waiting to see how the rising star would perform, although Nagyun thought of abstaining. If he chose to fight, he'd lose to anyone here. But the worst part is that his identity could be revealed. Eventually, Varen stood next to Yulnya and looked at Najin, not understanding anything. In reality, Rujian turned out to be weak. Even when she wanted to appear strong and determined, her real feelings were always hidden. Yulia looked at Najin, not understanding anything, and asked what he meant. In truth, Nagyun should have been glad that the man who had bullied him for so long had been humiliated in public. However, for some reason, the situation made him angry, and he told everyone that he would fight alone against them all. Fabian asked Rudy to be careful with Najin, he's dangerous. Around Nagyun's neck were the blades of the swords the knights pointed at him. He was very annoyed, so he flared up. He just wanted to instill fear in the crowd, but he didn't think they would react that way. Nagyun was able to capture every emotion on the faces of those present at that moment. Vigilance, fear, excitement, awkwardness, nervousness. Looking at him, Rudika asked if he was fed up with life, and if so, she would deal with him in a flash. Nagyun looked at her but didn't say anything back, and she decided to suspend the match. The knights went off to confer and consider their next steps. Fitterin said it had to stop. However, according to others, exceptions should not be made because the training was created to test the combat skills of students. Doubt gnawed at Darin. She didn't know if they could stop Najin in case of an emergency. Someone suggested that he should be expelled. Rudica approached Varon to ask for his opinion since the competition had been organized on his initiative. Varon was distracted because Najin, the rising star, reminded him of the old days. There have been similar incidents in the past. The knight whose feelings had been hurt had dealt with his abusers. She is called the strongest knight in the world. However, how can Varon compare her to this chick? The girls were outraged. In the end, the knights decided that the fight would be between Nagyan and Yulnia, but without weapons. The girl asked why they had made that decision, but Varon reassured her that this wasn't true, as it was just a warm-up fight, and they needed to consider all possible situations. She needed to focus on her opponent and avoid being careless, or she might miss a hit. The start of the fight was announced. Yulia stood in a stance in front of Najin, her fists clenched. He wondered what he should do. As expected, she would immediately attack, just as Vadran did. Nagyan was a little worried, but he needed to stay alert. Looking at Najin Yulnia, he thought about the fact that he has tons of disadvantages, but he seemed so confident. Yulia decided to attack first and kicked with her foot. Nagyan was right. He expected her to be so strong. He doesn't need to be psychic to know what she's going to do. You just have to look at her to be ready to strike. Nagyan believed that no matter how hard he was hit, his face should not express any emotion. As Yulnia struck, she saw that Najin remained calm. But why doesn't he attack? Watching from the sidelines, Varon concluded that the battle between the two was extraordinary. Najin didn't land a single blow, but he seemed to have the upper hand. Nuljan could see that Najin was putting psychological pressure on Yulnia. Behind him stood Quarren. She didn't understand the pressure Najin was under, and Nuljan explained that he was purposely skipping punches to show how little he cared about them. However, Najin does not intend to win exactly what everyone thought, because he possesses such power. But maybe he just didn't want to show his true strength. Fidderans didn't understand the real reason either. Yulia could understand Najin's actions in such a way that he was just afraid of accidentally killing his opponent. She was shaking with fear. To fight without worrying about getting killed. Nagyan thought this was an excellent opportunity to put his plan into action and test the results. Nagyan's ability to understand people's emotions is due to his phenomenal powers of observation. Such a skill is necessary for people to be able to feel each other's emotions. This is a skill that every person should possess as a social individual. Generally, there are approximately 100 classifications of various emotions. A simple person can understand only a part of them, but Nagyan can understand all of them. However, Nagyan can't always get away from a punch, and there are reasons for that. If a person attacks with a level equal to 10 units, the strength of the next strike will be reduced to 5 units. Could Nagyun launch a surprise attack? In his opinion, it would work, and he made an appropriate facial expression. It's not just an expression. It's a power that makes others believe you and has many different possibilities. Like making you feel like you're about to attack, Yonia put her hands over her face to block the blow. Thus, Nagyun had a chance to make that surprise attack. Everyone was watching to see what would happen. However, Nagyun's opponent didn't expect what kind of attack would be coming, and he punched her in the stomach. Yulia thought he'd punch her in the face and didn't see it coming. Najin doesn't give her any credit. Najin realized that it was over. With this ridiculous attack, Yulnia became even more determined. That's what happened. Yulnia's attack looked serious. Najin wondered how he could dodge it. Here, he is already lying on the ground, and Yulnia is sitting next to him, looking at him. Raojun ran up to Najin to see if he was all right. Rising from the ground, he asked what about the fight. Yulia was already leaving and reported that the fight was long over, and Najin had passed out from a single blow. She advised him to remember that her technique is called Martial Arts Galaxy, and she's not as weak as he might have thought. Next to Najin, on his lap, sat Raojuna, while on the other side stood Rujian. Looking at Yulnia's back, Rujian wondered who else was being arrogant here. She added that if Najin's body was fine, then he would definitely defeat her. Thinking that he had dishonored his brother's name, Nagyun asked for forgiveness. Even though he was defeated, it was a pivotal moment that would benefit him in the future. Walking up to Nuljan, Yulnia said she saw him talking to another girl. Najin, still sitting on the ground after the battle, asked Raojun where Thar was. Raojun pointed his index finger and said that his fight had been going on for a long time. Thar was slammed into the wall by his opponent's blow, but he clutched the dagger in his hand with confidence. In a cloud of dust, a small hurricane was swirling with sounds coming from it. It was Martha who said she was terribly disappointed about what happened to Najin. Wiping his mouth with his hand, Tar assumed Jin didn't want to show his full strength. Watching Tara sparring, Nagyun asked how long he had been out. He turned to Raojun, but the latter replied that he had only missed 2 fights and Tar had just started. In his head, Nagyun realized that 2 fights meant he missed 4 people. Rujin wondered if Tar would win, since she had heard a lot about Martha. She thought the only one who could compete with her was Nagyun. With all the rumbling, Martha stuck her sword right into the ground in front of Tar. He realized that she wanted to take him down with her bare hands, or maybe try something else. Nagyun thought Tara had a good chance of winning and told the guys so. He knew that the most essential thing in this business was to stay alert and read his opponent. The knights conferred, and Geos liked Martha's skills, but Nagyun left a different impression. The vixen, on the contrary, was relieved when he was overpowered because he was too careless. Fitterins reminded him that his opponent was from the galaxy of Julnia, and in general, people like him shouldn't be given preferential treatment. Threw her fists at Martha and attacked. Thar tried to defend himself with a dagger. She swung her foot and struck with such force that Tar flew off. He managed to slow down and couldn't believe his eyes that she was fighting him with her bare hands. Nagyun analyzed the fight and saw that Tara was shaking, and he was confused. Taru should take the sword stuck in the ground, or is it a decoy? Pouncing again, Martha flew over Tara. He looked ahead and didn't see her. Thinking she might be behind him, he turned around but saw no one there either. She came at him right on top of him, and Tar bounced sideways, sitting down on the ground. Martha glared at her opponent. It pissed her off that he was avoiding blows and becoming insecure. She thought Nagyun hated her. Standing up and holding his sword out in front of him, Tar reminded him that he had never said such a thing. There was a shout behind me. It was Jin who was telling Tara to be more careful. He kept yelling at Tar to remember what he did when he was with him. Nagyun knew that Tar was smart and would understand. Nagyun was approached by Jesus, who said he was crazy, and asked what he was doing. After answering that he was cheering up his friend, Nagyun was told that it was not a cheer but a clue, and Geos was watching him. Jean decided to argue with Jesus, saying that this should have been discussed beforehand and their rules were too arbitrary. Saying that he shouldn't, Raojun tried to stop him. Jesus stood silently. He had nothing to say to Nagyun because he was saying the right things. Realizes Geus that Nagyun is too troubled and he sees other people's weaknesses. He advised the young man to stop the conflict. Rujian and Raojun's faces were covered with drops of sweat. Hearing Nagyun's words, Tar tried to recall the battle he was referring to. Realizing that he was definitely faster than his opponent, Tar knew that Martha's abilities were of little interest to him. With a sharp jerk from his seat, Tar found himself behind Martha's back. He had a way to win. Martha turned around and came face to face with Tar, bringing her fist down on him. She had incredible visual acuity, but Tar sped up and she decided to focus. Her eyes lit up with a yellow light. Thar was grateful that she was now focused on him. Tar's advantage was that he was swift, and his way of winning was to blind her. Holding out his hand, Rose smiled. Thar and Rujian stood behind him, their faces sullen. When Nagyon was bullied, Tar always stood behind all the guys. He never took part in the bullying, he just watched from the sidelines. The reason was that Thar realized that Rujian considered herself a victim of circumstance. However, he saw no justification for violence against Nagyon, but he knew that Rujian was difficult to judge rationally. At least, that's what he was thinking. Thar made sure they didn't cross the line. Discussing the fight, the knights came to the conclusion that Thar fights much better than they could have guessed. When Tara managed to blind Martha, he didn't hesitate and struck her decisively. But suddenly, Martha shouted a fin, and the sword she stuck into the ground lit up with a yellow light. She was able to strike, and Tar wondered if her weapon could sense since she couldn't attack while blinded. Martha opened her eyes slightly and saw Tara through the veil, but could see that he was still recovering. She joked that he'd scared her, but his weapon didn't work against her, and what he'd do now, for Tara, it was a failure. He used all the light, and she even managed to hit him. No chance of winning. Fitterins felt ashamed of himself for treating Tar with disdain, for despite his doubts, Tar held up well. Holding a dagger in one hand, Tar raised his hands in the air and said he surrendered. The fellow students watching him were astonished at the news, but this was not what they had expected. Varen grabbed his helmet and was clearly upset that it had ended this way. Approaching the team, Tar heard praise from Raojun, but Najin asked why he had given up. Closing his eyes, Tar began to explain that he had already spent all the light and the weapons had become useless. He felt he didn't stand a chance. Thoughtfully, Najin began to reason. Martha couldn't have known that the light could only be used once a day, so it was a bluff. Thar was angry. In his opinion, Najin was in no position to give out advice, but Najin told Tar to keep it in mind because it might be helpful next time. Turning away, Thar started to walk away and threw it back, saying he was just weak on this one. After all, it's very easy to say that Tara had a chance to win, but he can't think like Najin. Rujian was concerned that Najin was being too hard on Tar even though the fight was already over, and Najin felt bad that Tar had lost. He was confident that Thar could have won, but chose to surrender. The sparring continued, and the next lot drawn was blue. It was the turn of Raojun, the last apprentice student from Udion. The boys stood opposite each other. Raojun wished his opponent good luck, but Daragon laughed at him and asked how they had passed the exam in the first place. The opponent thought they were all weak. Thar was still doing well, but he just gave up. Shame on them for being there. He was sure that at least Najin had passed for a reason, but he arrogantly ignored his opponent. Daragon advised them to return to Udion. Raojun turned to Varen to make sure he would save his apprentice from death in time, and Daragon laughed at that. They announced the start of the fight. Raojun's face changed, and Nagyun noticed it immediately. The memories were almost erased. For some reason, Raojun couldn't take it anymore. It was cold, winter. A little boy stood in the middle of a snow-covered wasteland. He just wanted to forget everything. He was cold and lonely. He fell to the ground. Someone shouted for him to get up, and the boy opened his eyes. He was completely snowed in, and people thought he was dead. The boy stood up and saw two identical guys in front of him. They asked if he was all right. That was how Raojun met his brothers. Daragon began to quickly swing a whip, trying to hurt Raojun, but Raojun easily dodged her. Suddenly, she cupped his cheek and he drew his weapon. Darlington couldn't believe it was a katana. He tried to overpower it with the whip, and the sharp sounds of blows could be heard. The sound of the blows was so frightening that Rujian worried whether Raojun would be able to win, given his habit of skipping class. Tara's voice came from behind the boys. He was saying that the enemy was good at sensing distance, attacking quickly, and his blows were accurate. However, Raojun is good at predicting attacks and avoiding them, but the problem is different. In Nagyon's opinion, Raojun's sword skills are powerful, but he needs time to prepare. Thar agreed and added that Raojun also lacks basic skills. He has only horizontal punching skills. His chances of victory were slim. He was beginning to slow down, and at this rate, it was only a matter of time before the battle was over. Suddenly, Raojun lowered his katana hand, and Daragon thought he had stopped. Daragon had thoughts in his mind that Udion students were helpless creatures. Thoughts flashed through Nagyon and Tara's minds as well that Raojun had surrendered. But Nagyon knew that Raojun was far simpler and more reckless than anyone would think. The enemy attacked Ranjun, and Rujian shrieked that he had hit, but Nagyun said to watch closely. Daragon's weapon differs from a typical sword or spear blade. It is not possible to die after receiving a few blows from it. That's why Daragon's attacks are nothing to Raojun. The boys have seen that he's reckless. Darlington didn't realize whether his opponent hoped he would stand idly by, but he wrapped the whip around his ankle. He had to strike at once. He tried to pull the whip toward him so that Raojun would fall, but he stood like a rock. Though Raojun was tied up, he decided to strike horizontally, and Daragon flew back into the enclosure next to him, breaking it into splinters. Originally, Raojun was not from Udion. The twins looked at him and asked where he came from. They thought he didn't remember anything at all because the boy looked at them with green eyes that seemed to understand nothing. Holding out a hand of food, they offered him a snack, and Nagyon offered to stay with them until his memory returned. An indignant Najin disagreed, but his brother explained to him that there was enough food for the three of them, and suddenly, the boy raised his voice. He chewed the bread and was delighted that the bread was warm. Nagyon said he would stay with them until he remembered everything. In the end, his memory never returned to Raojun. He became independent and stayed in Udion forever. The knights watching Raojun's strike were surprised by such a technique. It was too much, in Daragon's opinion, and he became furious as he climbed out from under the rubble. Using a horizontal section, Raojun struck again, but Daragon dodged it in time. Deciding to use another horizontal section, Raojun climbed higher in preparation for the jump. But Varen had already raised his spear upward about to stop the fight. With a clatter, Raojun fell to the ground, and Varen declared him the winner. The guys were shocked at how Varen had stopped Raojun, and they wondered what the spear was. The sun was slipping towards sunset, and the last fight of the day was announced. It was between Pimmel and Jiren. In the end, the winner was Pimmel of Ratun. His hand was shaking. The first part of the warm-up match was over. The second would be tomorrow at dawn. Varen let everyone rest. When Varen said that the victors would fight the Raojun Knights the next day, he was shocked. Afterward, Vadrine decided to make fun of the guys by saying that they were lucky that at least one of them won. But Najin decided to ask Raojun what kind of spear it was that moved independently in the air after being thrown, but Raojun didn't know. Furious at being ignored, Vadrine jumped into the conversation, saying it was a knight's spear and its name was Naringen. Weapons descended from the heavens. They differ from the masterpieces made by the most famous craftsmen and have abilities beyond human control. Remembering, Najin asked about Martha's sword. Maybe her weapon was one of those too. Wadran was finally furious and shouted, asking if Najin could hear him. He yelled at him that he was weak. Yulia and Noljan stood up for him, saying he wasn't weak, she was just on a different level. But Vadran didn't like that. Standing outside the house, Rujian told Thar that they would have to be on night duty again, but Thar thought they were free and could sleep soundly. When night fell, it was time for the knights to assemble, and they stood in a circle, gathered in a room. Gios thought that they should calm down first, because they were supposed to be an example for the guys. Wolf decided to ask at once who they thought was the strongest, and the two decided it was Martha. Fox sided with Yulnia Darin and agreed with her. Varen thought it was Martha too, and asked who they were expecting something special from. Siding with Ruji and Wolf said she held on to the last one despite her opponent having a clear advantage. But Jayus sided with Raojun, thinking him a strong candidate. Fox had no challenger, but Darin sided with Vadran, saying it would be fun to watch him. But which student they needed the most? They all agreed that it was Najin, thinking that he would be of great help to them in the future, who the mentors thought had the best chance of becoming a knight. And the choice was obvious. A flashback of Najin entering a house full of strangers in robes. He falls into the abyss, seeing a bright flash of white light screaming his brother's name. Lying on the floor with his hand in the air, Negan shouted no. A disheveled Rujian stood next to him, asking what he meant because she hadn't slept well either. While Nagyan was putting his hair back in a ponytail, Vadran came to him, wondering what Najin had dreamed, but Nagyan didn't listen to him. He wondered what would have happened if he had been inside the house that day. His brother was alive. Standing in the middle of the square, Varen repeated that there would be a confrontation between the victors and the knights. Pointing his finger at a girl with long black hair, Varen said that Raymond would be the first because she automatically passed to the next stage. Thinking which of the knights would be her opponent, he pointed to Fox and asked if she wanted one. But the volunteer was a Fitteran, who showed off his biceps and said he'd warm up at the same time. Standing in front of Raymond, holding the sword in his hand, Fitterans hid one hand behind his back, saying he wouldn't use it. Raymond was attacking him, trying to throw punches, but he dodged them easily. Suddenly, Raymond's sword flew toward Rujian and Nagyan and slammed into the building between them. Fujian cried out, and Nagyan stood stone-faced. Watching the fight, Tar asked if they had noticed before that Raymond looked like Raujun, but Rujian said it seemed to him. Looking at Raujun Nagyun, he thought that if they were distant relatives, then that meant he was from Rathun. Suddenly, Raymond stopped, and Fitterans asked why she wasn't doing her best. Looking at him, she replied that she didn't understand why she would do her best if her opponent didn't do the same. Grinning, Fitterans asked Duran to throw his weapon, and she tossed him a huge knife. Catching him, he told Raymond to take his weapon and not to regret what he had done. Taking the sword, Paimel threw it to Raymond, and she caught it. Clutching it tightly, she stood in front of her opponent. Fitterans struck with such force that Varen was worried he might inadvertently finish her off and reminded him of that. Standing up cheerfully, leaning on his weapon, Fitterans said that he, unlike Varen, had thought to strike with the back of his sword. Climbing out of the pillar of dust, Raymond thought that Fitterans was very strong. Behind Varen's back, Pimmel ran towards Raymond, worried if she was alive. Varen asked the winners of the first round to get ready. 7 men were too many, and Varen asked Darren when they would start organizing the squads. She replied that it would be tonight. The winners listened attentively to what Varen had to say. He said that a tournament system would be implemented after 2 defeats. He stood in a stance and told the students to attack him simultaneously. Turning around, Raojun saw Najin and asked how he was. He reported that he had noticed how long it was taking him to complete the horizontal section. He advised preparing to use the skill in advance and trying not to stand in front, but to attack from the rear. A fight broke out. Everyone grabbed their weapons and ran in different directions. Everyone looked up into the sky and saw Varen launch his spear into the sky. As Vadran stood looking up at the sky, Varen came up to him, saying he was very cocky, and he struck. Vadran flew off at once into a pile of stones nearby. He rolled to the ground, his mouth drooling. Jesus asked Foxwolf and Darren to prepare because their help might be needed. Watching Varen's attack, Turisan was furious that he was using the spear as a distraction. While he was thinking, Varen had time to attack him as well. Rujian, who was watching from afar, realized that martial arts was no joke as Varen was playing with his students without even using weapons. Nearby, Nagyun realized that the disciples would fail because each fought separately and failed to utilize their advantages. The martial arts galaxy stunned Varen as Yolnia threw a punch at him. No matter how strong a knight you were, facing 7 unarmed men at once seemed impossible to Tar, but Nagyon disagreed with him. There was a flash of light in the sky, and the spear flew almost at Martha's face. It was flying towards Pimmel, right into his chest. He just stood there and watched it approach. Yulia turned her head away, and Varen said she had disappointed him with that, asking why she wasn't looking at him. Somewhere behind his back, Rojun uttered a horizontal section. He attacked Varen from behind. However, when Varen turned around, his trusty spear split the wave of the section, thus saving his master. They were getting closer and closer to him. Varen realized this, so he picked up his weapon and decided that the real fun was about to begin. But the knights interrupted him, thinking that was enough for today. Unfolding her umbrella, Rudica stood in front of Raujun's face to fend off Varan's attack. Blue Wolf went for the spear to stop his action. Outraged, Varen turned to ask why they wouldn't let him play, but the knights attacked him. A pillar of light pinned Varen to the ground. Getting out from under the rubble, Varen said it was too much and could have just said. Darren stood sternly above him with his sword. Announcing that the warm-up match was over, the knights told the Chweniks to wait for the squad to gather. Looking at his hands, Pimmel was frustrated that he couldn't do anything. The battle that had just occurred made everyone realize the significant difference between knights and apprentices. Except for one man, Nagyan felt it was better to use Naringen than any other weapon. After a short time, the knights announced that the squad was assembled and would consist of 4 men. The squad leader is a knight, accompanied by 3 apprentices. Training will be conducted concurrently with the mission, and squad members will be continually reorganized. The guys were asked to greet each other because whether they liked it or not, they would now be working together. Looking at Najin, Nuljan said he hoped he would, and Nagyun quietly said yes. The girl from the Knights Management Committee was reading the paper on which the members of Darren's squad were written, and she said she would submit it to the management. The students were discussing who was in which squad, and Rujin got into the Fitterin squad. Raujin was assigned to Mrs. Fox, and Tara was assigned to Darren. Knight Giraffe was assigned to Knight Nagyon. They were all scattered to different places. Giraffe hurried Nagyon up and told them to leave, and Nagyon told them to get stronger and meet again. So, he went to Jesus and said that they would be walking a long way, so they had to get out early. Julia and Nuljan were ahead of him. Worry enveloped Raujin, and he asked if Najin would be okay. Still, Raujin said there was no reason to worry because it was Najin. But Raujin thought he had something wrong and wanted to say something about it, but Tar interrupted him, saying that they were the ones to worry about. In Tara's opinion, though Najin doesn't have the strength he used to, he never once seemed weak. Nagyun has grown very attached to the guys over time. Jaius' squad moved along the road through the forest. He walked ahead as a leader, and the students followed behind. Deciding to take a break, Gia sat down on a large tree stump and informed the boys that they would rest a bit and continue on their way. Nagyun had a question and turned to the knight. The question was about the Naringen spear that Varan had. He wondered how he could obtain such a weapon. Jesus looked at him askew. He began to explain that Naringen-type weapons are scarce, and even if you get them, not everyone can use them. In fact, unlike conventional weapons, the Naringen itself chooses its owner, to whom it will allow the use of its abilities. Pensively placing a hand on his chin, Nagyan thought that such a weapon would be difficult to obtain. Standing at the Knights meeting, Jaios announced that he would take Najin with him. Wolf thought he didn't like people like that, and he was right, but Giraffe was planning to check something out. Sitting on a stump, Gios pondered the fact that Najin was a strange guy and he couldn't figure him out. Thinking back to their fight with Yulnia, he felt it was too absurd if Najin just wanted to let someone's guard down. And Najin is a lot different now than it was before. If Najin wants to appear weak, why? Why would he do that? These thoughts never left the knight's mind. Najin saw Gios looking at him from the side and realized he suspected him of something. The 2 shrewdest knights of all are the Black Hen and the light blue Giraffe. Though Varan is no threat, Gios is one to watch out for. Maybe it's because of the fight with Yulnia. Of course, it would be better if Nagyun tried to keep a low profile, but when he's under suspicion all the time, how can he do that? So he decided to act. Turning to Yulnia, he said he was surprised yesterday and apologized for looking down on her. He realized he'd been neglecting the basics for nothing and thanked her. She smiled back. Coughing, she said that she expected him to be very attentive and asked him not to blame herself too much because the fact was that she was strong. He asked her about the basics of martial arts, saying he was sure he could learn a lot from her. Looking at him, she covered her mouth with her hand so he wouldn't see her smile, and Nuljan frowned at her. It is the duty of the strong to care for the weak, and since he has lost to her, she will take him into her care. Turning to Yulnia, Nuljan asked if she was sure, but Yulnia thought the basics would be no problem. Jesus was watching their conversation. If Najin relied on his senses, then why was he saying he lacked basic skills now? Gius was looking for the real reason. Glancing at Najin, he thought about the fact that the apprentice might be harboring suspicions, and folding his hands in his pockets, Gios ordered him to move out. What if Najin exploited Yulnia's desire for recognition for personal gain through the psychology of competition, and if he got inside Gios' head? Following their leader, Nagyan and Yulnia practiced right along the way. As dusk began to fall, they built a fire and sat around it. Gios lectured about how strength can be used to destroy an opponent, and the guys listened attentively. First and foremost, you must be strong. Not powerful is a famous expression, and Gios advised memorizing it. A few days passed. Gios announced that they had arrived. Their mission begins with Kronel. They stood on a hill in front of a small town, surrounded by a large stone wall. The city was much larger than Udion, and Nuljin noticed that it appeared to be quite close. Jesus said he'd picked the closest place himself. Lowering her eyes to the floor, Yulnia thought about what she wanted to eat. Still, Nuljin immediately asked what their mission was. After saying that the mission would not be dangerous and there was nothing to worry about, Gios told that they needed to find someone to start with. Nuljin asked who they needed to find, but Gios only gave him a smile. They needed to find a mage. Gios' squad was marching through Kronel, and Nagyan wondered why they needed a mage. Without even turning around, Gios replied that this was not just a meeting. They would have to escort the mage to the capital. Magister capital. Escort. Nagyan asked why and was told it was a secret. When they heard someone's stomach rumble, the group stopped, looking at each other. Yulia pretended it wasn't hers. She turned to Jesus, asking him if it might be best for them to grab a bite to eat before heading out. The knight remained silent. Saying that he would meet the magician alone, Gios sent the boys to lunch, and after lunch, he appointed a meeting place for them to set out on the road at once. And he left, leaving them alone. Yulia immediately asked what they would be eating. Turning to her, Nuljin asked what she wanted and was told that she would have soup and something else. Behind them stood a man in a robe. The stranger went behind Najin's back and was overlooked. Najin told the boys that he didn't care what he had. Suddenly, Nuljin noticed that Nujin's sword was missing. Turning around and noticing the man in the robe, Najin followed him at once. However, Nuljin and Yulnia immediately decided to run, pointing at the stranger and shouting that he must be stopped because he was a thief. Looking at the stranger, Nagyon suddenly realized who it was because he noticed a familiar mask on his face. Nagyon clenched his teeth in fury and rushed after the thief. At the same time, he wondered if it was right to follow him. Nuljin stood in the aisle and beckoned Najin over to him, pointing with his hand where to go. It was a dead end. A masked man stood against the wall with a sword in his hand. Yulia announced, notably, that they were the knight's apprentices, and if he returned the sword to them, they would let him go. Martial Arts Galaxy Part 2. Yulia jumped up to the stranger, and her eyes shone with light. She attacked him with a lightning bolt, and a flash of light, accompanied by a crackling sound, appeared where they had just been. Kicking her foot into the wall where the man should be, she was surprised to find that she had broken through the wall, but the man was gone. Nuljin was next to show his skill, but the stranger dodged his attack as well. And so he lunged with a sword in hand at the unarmed Nagyon. Nagyon knew he was the target. Suddenly, some red-clothed man stood between Nagyon and his opponent and repelled the attack with a shockwave. His opponent was on the roof of a building. The man who had sent him there beckoned to him. The stranger didn't want to engage such an opponent in battle, so he threw the stolen sword at his feet. Nagyon's defender looked at his enemy and bid him to continue, but the man was looking down at him from the roof. Nagyon wondered who his protector was. Apparently, the enemy didn't want to continue the fight with a new opponent, so he fled the scene. Turning to Najin, Nuljin asked if he was all right, but Nagyon was interested in his protector because he had no idea who he was. Taking the liberty of asking first, Yulnia wondered if he was a knight by any chance. The man replied that he was not a knight and added that he was just passing by. Looking at him, Yulnia couldn't believe that he was at such a high level and wasn't a knight. Nuljin decided to just say thank you. As Najin put his sword away in its sheath, Yulnia said he was clumsy, and Nuljin added that it was more accurate to say he was inattentive. Noticing the stranger's gaze, Nagyan looked at him and clarified if they had met before. The stranger smiled and said he remembered every person he met, but he thought they might meet again later. The boys had already turned around and were on their way when Yulnia turned around and called out to Najin because Nuljin was hungry. Najin couldn't take his eyes off of her. Turning around, Nagyon went to catch up with the team while the stranger remained standing and stared after them. A silhouette appeared in the wall behind the stranger, and addressing him, the stranger said that he had asked for no amateurishness. The man in the robe returned. Back to the boys, Gios said that the situation had changed, and they were leaving now. The mage was standing next to him. He informed the guys that they would be eating on the way, and Yulnia obviously didn't expect such a turn of events that she even opened her mouth. Standing next to Yulnia, Nuljin reported that they had almost eaten everything. Jesus told them not to worry because he had a plan and set off, ordering them to follow him. When the mage took off his hood, the guys saw a guy with short white hair. He introduced himself, and his name was Schumann. Turning to Geos, Negan asked what had changed in their situation. However, his question was answered by the mage, who informed him that someone had been following him lately, and he feared for his life. When he asked for their help, Negan wondered about the pursuit, but decided he couldn't know for sure. But until they could determine if Schumann was really being pursued by someone, Geos asked him to just be careful. The magician was not reassured by this. He was very worried. Already standing in the forest, Yulnia stopped and turned to the knight to see what about the food. Jesus held out a leaf of the herb to the girl and said that the plant was called Jamie, and that if eaten raw, it would cause diarrhea. The prospect of eating grass did not appeal to Yulnia. However, Geos thought it was a good option in the field, and that it was nutritious if cooked. After sending Najin and Nuljin into the forest to find food for him to prepare, Jesus said that he and Yulnia would accompany the mage. Plucking some flowers, Nuljin heard from Najin that it was better to pick them because the plant was not compatible with other food. Looking at the plant in his hand, Nuljin asked Najin how he knew it, and he said he had lived near the forest and eaten it as a child. Najin asked Nuljin if he had lost the fight since he was out of it. Closing his eyes, Nuljin reported that he lost because he was weak, and without Yulnia, he was nothing. As the conversation continued, Nuljin asked why Najin thought the shield was more advantageous than that. For Najin, it was simple. Both the shield and spear are mighty, and if these implements never break, then the man with the shield has a better chance of winning. The only thing that he thought would make a difference was the skill of wielding it. Najin finished picking a plant. Nuljin stopped to think that Najin must have been practicing for a long time to have considered this far ahead, but Jin distracted him by reminding him to eat. In Yulnia's hands was a container of herbs and miscellaneous items. Looking at her, Nuljin apologized for the lack of meat. Yulnia's eyes became round. Turning to Schumann, Yulnia handed him a container and asked him to turn the herb into meat. Looking at the girl over his shoulder, Schumann thought that commoners were all the same and felt that they could do anything with magic. They have no idea how difficult magic is to use. The slightest miscalculation won't work. Without knowing any formula, they think it's so easy to create a new one. Magic is a joke to them. And with a smile, Schumann told Yulnia that he couldn't do that, and she clucked her tongue. Everyone had eaten, and before heading out, Eos decided to do a little training. The fight will be between the losers of the last match, namely Nuljin and Najin. The fight will last 3 minutes. Practice is necessary to identify weaknesses and work on improving them. The opponents are facing each other. When Jesus gave the command, they started. Nagyun decided to keep his distance to avoid the attack and ran back. Nagyun also watched the warm-up match very closely. He observed the habits and postures of the strong players. The goal for Nagyun is to pretend he's trained in the galactic martial arts of Yulnia. Looking at Najin, Yulnia couldn't believe that he had learned so quickly. Standing in the rack opposite Najin Nuljin, he thought he had matured, and unlike the warm-up match, now he could see no gaps. Nagyun was not afraid. He decided to do the same as Yulnia and rushed to attack. Folding his arms across his chest, Nuljin decided to protect his head. Nagyun may be stronger now than he was then, but his attack isn't as powerful yet. He needed a place where the pain would manifest itself at once, and he knew such a place because he had been beaten before. He remembered Russ. With all his might, Nagyun struck his opponent's liver. Nuljin choked and stepped back. Schumann, who was watching the match, knew that it was painful because even healing magic was difficult to use in that place. After telling Schumann not to worry, Jesus said to him that Yulnia had a little strength left. Looking at her obliquely, Schumann thought she was stupid for talking nonsense. Geos analyzed the fight. He saw that Najin was clearly trying to punch his opponent in the face, so Nuljin covered his face with his hands. However, the blow came to the stomach, and it was precisely the same situation as during the warm-up match. It wasn't like galactic martial arts. Jesus realized that the blow was explicitly aimed at the liver. As he looked at his opponent, Nagyun thought he had done something wrong because a proper hit should make it hard for him to breathe. Nuljin attacked next, but Nagyun easily dodged his blow. Jesus didn't understand why they weren't fighting at full strength. He even thought that Najin was like him. He stopped the fight. Nuljin didn't understand why there was still time. But Geos decided that enough was enough. Instead, we could talk about complementing each other. Turning to Najin, he asked if there was a reason why he was so weak, and Najin said there was. Bowing his head, Yaios let it be known that he understood and said to continue on his way. The fox stopped and asked the troop if they were having a hard time and if they would like to rest. Barely catching their breath, Rudika's squad of sweaty guys answered no way. Offering to speed up in that case, Fox went, and the shocked lads responded by eating. But Fitterin stuck his sword in the ground and gave a lecture to his squad. He said it's no good being cocky. After all, many people in the world are stronger than them, and they should constantly be honing their skills. The squad listened attentively. Darren's squad ran all left. She shouted to them, "If anyone wants to surrender, all of you," with glee answered no. Varen wanted to know what his squad would do if he tried to massacre them here, and now he extended his index finger, waiting for an answer. There were only girls in his squad, and Martha replied that she would block him, while Quarren and Jiren would help him. However, even though she was the strongest among them, the three of them had no chance of winning, and Martha understood that. Varen liked that she was confident, but he thought she was overdoing it. Varen had a potent weapon. Varen tells Martha that her plan is vague, and that if Najin were here, he would offer a more straightforward strategy. In Jaius's opinion, Varen was a dangerous man, and he warned the students not to get too close to him. He asked Najin if he was going to ask Varan about Naringin. Shumin, who was standing next to him, shouted, not believing that Varan was their comrade. I was sure Shumin was sure Varen was crazy, but Jius said they couldn't prove it yet. The mage was overcome with fear and kept shouting that he was scared and would not go anywhere. Nul'jin behind him thought how such a man was responsible for their training. Ahead of them, Jius said it was his fault. The boys wondered if Varen was the only one of all the knights who had a black color. Turning to them, Jaius explained that it didn't mean anything bad. The more saturated the color, the stronger the person. Julia, who was standing nearby, thought the light colors were prettier. Nul'jin asked if the rumors were true. The knight was curious about Najin's opinion, but he replied that such a perception was unfounded. Being strong, one should leave a memorable impression. People will only be able to recognize the color black like Varen. However, there will always be a tendency to validate one's point of view. People will believe what they want, and in this, it was surprising to Jius that their thoughts with Najin coincided. Nul'jin disagreed with him, but Najin asked how strong Mr. Giraffe himself was. Further unexpected news for the guys was that Jius said everyone sees that he is weak, but in reality, it is even worse. Overall, Jius was weaker than Varen, but I thought he was on the same level as Yulnia. It was for these reasons that Jius's squad was formed in this manner. While still standing with his back to the students, Jius gave them a task on their way to meet an enemy whose strength is equal to that of a knight. They need to strategize. With a bright look, Yulnia started to say something to Najin, but he thought the assignment was bullshit and was given to mess with them. Turning around, Nagin turned to the mage, saying he had a couple of questions and a request. Night had fallen. In the twilight, bandaged hands lifted a piece of paper from the grass. The man in a skull mask and a high hat, looking at the paper, thought it was about a sorcerer who deals with hexes. In the night, his eyes burned red. Since he is the first tip of His Highness's spear, he decides to advance. Walking in the twilight behind Juice, Nagyun pondered that he was not able to read him as easily as the others. His thoughts were interrupted by Xiumin, who asked him if he was listening to him because he had asked him to tell him. Nagyun turned around and repeated his last words. Folding his hands in a lock, Xiumin told him how to use magic and finished by asking for demonic power. Najin didn't understand what it meant to ask. The mage began to tell him that the power of the spell depended on how favored the caster was. Getting a mage's favor is not the easiest thing to do, and even if you get mana and the mana request is incorrectly set, the magic just won't work. Looking at the mage, Nagyun asked what about him, and Xiumin replied that he was doing great, making requests since he had the talent. Holding some parchment in his hand, Nagyun asked how strong the mana needed to be to use it. Xiumin said to take the paper with both hands and glow to gather energy around him. Nagyun did that. The paper flashed in his hands, illuminated by a bright white light that illuminated everything around him. Standing in the middle of the town, Varen said it was a mage. The squad didn't understand and asked again. Fitterin Wolf's unit was in the forest when he told them about the mage. Darren was also in town with a squad and almost blabbed to them about why they needed a mage. Standing at the door, Rudika told her squad that they would now be able to see one of the mages and turned the knob. Opening the door wide and entering the house, Fitterins loudly asked, "Mr. Mage, are you here?" Darren was shocked by the sight. Varen was also shocked. A dead man was sitting on the floor and traces of blood were everywhere. It was all over. At first, Nagyun squeezed his eyes shut against the bright light, but when he opened them, he saw Juice in front of him. A shining light was burning in front of him. Jesus also had a paper in his hands on which incomprehensible symbols in the form of circles and triangles glowed. The knight said to stop. Nagyun asked the mage what was wrong, and Xiumin replied that Jius must have received a summons. Xiumin noticed the parchment in Nagyun's hands and cried out. Nagyun looked at the paper and saw that it was completely unlit. He was upset, but the mage reassured him that it was not a talent that anyone could possess. Watching what Nagyun was doing with the mage, Yulnia jumped into the conversation and informed him that she knew how to use magic a little. But Nagyun oversaw Jios. He knew that the object in his hands was used in emergencies. The magician said that such a paper already contains magic and functions so that people who are not favored by mana can use it. Interrupting the dialogue, Jesus said that they had an emergency because the mage their companions were supposed to meet had died. Perhaps Xiumin would be next. At this news, Xiumin began to shout, and Nagyun said it was necessary to determine if there was a spy among them. That was a proposition Jius agreed with. He was certain that the spy was not far away. The question was whether he would give himself away by admitting it. Looking at Najin Jius, I saw that his face expressed no emotion, and I wondered whether he could speak objectively about him then. To the guys, Jios told them that there was probably no spy among them, because they had a man who thought more about food than a mage. They also have a man who is interested in a man thinking about food. Noljin looked away at those words. And finally, there's a man among them raring to find a spy, so Jios thinks there's no spy among them. Besides, if Jios had been a spy, he would have killed the mage the first time he met him, and Jios had asked Najin to stop looking at Xiumin. Looking at the crying mage, Nagyun realized that he could not be a spy because he had never once inquired about their plan of action. Looking at Xiumin, Jesus said that they would have to change the route because, carrying his body, they had no desire. They urgently needed to come up with a plan of action, and Jios asked what Najin's thoughts were. It seemed to Najin that they needed to reorganize the fighting force for a real battle. But Jios asked sharply what he meant, for he had explained what had happened to the comrades. Najin thinks it's all a joke. Drops of sweat appeared on Nagyun's neck, and he stammered that he didn't think so. Looking at Jios, Nagyun wondered if he was faking it or if he was really weak. Jesus said to move out as soon as possible. Droplets of blood fell to the ground. The squad watched the knight. Fitterins grabbed his wounded shoulder. A man in a hat and wearing a skull mask came out of a house across the street from them with a gun. The knight also held a weapon and told the squad to listen to him carefully. They needed to turn and run immediately. And the two adversaries came together in battle. Each of them rushed to attack his enemy. Fitterins tried to attack the enemy, but he evaded the blows. The enemy stopped in front of him and said, "These are you people called knights." The students ran. Behind them, they heard a rumbling sound and flashes of light from the forest. Using his sword as a shield, Fitterins deflected the enemy's blows. He thought he had wounded him, but the enemy continued to fight steadily. As they walked, Nagyun decided to ask Yus if he was a free knight. There are two kinds of knights. There are class knights, or those who were selected by examination. Free knights are those who have significant influence and receive a badge of honor in the name of not being hostile to the emperor. Turning to the students, Jius asked if they knew what their main difference was. Noljin replied that the class members were stronger because they had passed exams and were trained in various techniques. Statistically, class knights are indeed stronger, but there are times when the free can surpass them, and not all people strive for it. Perhaps it was an honor that suggested Yulnia look at Jios's back, and he replied that it was close. Deciding to tell, Jesus himself said that the most crucial difference between knights is the commandment. The students listened. Each class knight pledges to take an oath to the emperor, and the oaths of all knights are different. Its contents are known only to the emperor and a couple of close associates. In Jai's opinion, the class knight's oath to live and die with honor is very onerous. Turning to his students, Jius asked why all the knights made such an oath. Only Nagyun answered, saying it was for control. The answer is correct. You can't kill an enemy who has his back on you. You can only harm someone who is standing firmly on the ground, and you can only attack someone who is sighted. Standing in front of the squad, Jius continued. Such moments are controlled by the class knights during the exam preparations. Such commandments epitomize the chains that bind the sword. Yulia didn't know that before. Jesus said he would answer the question that had started the conversation. Nagyun stood behind him and listened intently, and answered. Jesus was a class knight. He was weakened by the chains that bound him, but he gained a different kind of strength instead. However, the ability he gained is a secret, and Jius warns the guys that everything he told them today is confidential. Being weak in the midst of all this is dangerous, though Nagyun. He should stay in the care of the knights until he gains strength. Stopping and looking ahead at the white light, Jius announced that they were in position. As they emerged from the forest, everyone saw that there was a literal icy wasteland awaiting them. Thinking back to the time he was walking with the magazine in his arms and saying he wanted to go everywhere, Nagyun smiled, and Yulnia noticed it. The forest beyond the desert was their destination. Jesus said that there they should join up with another group. Yulia touched the ice, and Nuljin was concerned, but she started yelling at him that there was nothing wrong with it. Scrunching his nose, Shumin approached Najin, saying that he had a request. But Najin was silent. He stood and looked ahead of him without paying attention to the mage. He was smiling. Before him, the sun was rising, and the icy rocks were enveloped in dawn. Najin stood aside, and Gios hurried him away, for they were already approaching the forest. The guys asked him if he was so excited about what he was seeing for the first time, and Nagyon couldn't find the words to answer. Noticing that the bushes were moving, Gios ordered the team to stop. The mage hid behind Najin's back. Julia, standing next to him, clenched her fists. Suddenly, a screaming Rujian literally flew out of the bushes. She stopped to catch her breath. She shouted something about a Fiteran night. Gios demanded an explanation of what had happened. There was an explosion, accompanied by a flash of white light behind the squad. Everyone turned around at the sound. In front of them stood the masked and hat-wearing man who had attacked Fitorence's squad. Saying that no explanation was needed, Gios gave the command to prepare for battle. Things are heating up between the Eastern Continent and the Central Continent, where Nagyon and the others now are. The Lord of the Eastern Continent is guarded by 5 watchdogs. Lord Naryon's first spear. Due to one incident, it became known as the Broken Spear. He was the one who had gotten in the way of Gios' squad. He turned to Rujian and asked if it was Naryuna, and received a positive answer. Judging by the stranger's appearance, Gios realized that he came from the east and was unlikely to answer his questions. Turning to the squad, Gios said to remember 2 things. The first was to protect the mage at all costs, and secondly, they must survive at all costs. And Gios rushed to attack Naryon. He attacked with such force that Naryon was thrown back by the shockwave. Taking out a dagger, Naryon tried to stab it, but Gios intercepted his hand. Looking at Gios, Naryon finally said, "You took your hands out of your pockets and called him a pathetic creature." Throwing Gios back with a kick, Naryon moved toward the squad. When Naryon approached the squad, he said he guessed which one of them was the mage. Shumin cried, looking at him. He told the others to come out so they could get to know each other better. Naryon swung his dagger at them. Yulia rushed into the fight and was almost immediately shot in the shoulder. She screamed for Najin and Nuljin to protect the mage. Jayus arrived in time, and together with Yulnia, they launched a 2-sided attack against the enemy. While trying to strike, Gios noticed that a transparent veil had formed between him and Naryon. At that time, Narayan attacked. Yulia fell down as she was wounded. A pool of blood ran from her shoulder. Nagyon screamed. Nuljin was silent. Memories came flooding back to Nuljin. He remembered their first meeting, and how she told him she was now his guardian, Galactica's rightful successor. She was his protector. She thought the strong should protect the weak. The elders never praised Yulnia. They only spoke admonitions. However, Yulnia continued to hone herself and her skills without any admonishment. In the galaxy, the elders thought that Najin was a talented guy and could easily become a leader. She was told that if she had even a fraction of Najin's talent, it would be great. She should be like that, so she should try harder. At that moment, Nuljin realized he was the only one who thought she was the best. Glancing at Yulnia, he said that greed had ultimately ruined her. He strode forward to meet the enemy, and without turning back, he turned to the mage to heal Yulnia. The blow that Nuljin threw was powerful. Nuljin shouted to Najin that he should keep it a secret from Yulnia. Standing against the wall, Yulnia was pleased that she had managed to break through it. Nuljin watched her from the corner. Watching Nuljin was something she was glad she could do. The power of the martial arts galaxy had only been passed down to Yulnia. Folding her arms, Yulnia said that it was her duty to help the weak and that she could teach him the foundation because she was his guardian. In the forest, Nuljin carried a screed of firewood somewhere on his back. Sometimes he tried to mimic Galaxy's martial arts skills. It was now just for curiosity or fooling around that he was able to realize his talent. However, he decided to keep it a secret. It was all for Jolnia's sake. For a moment, Nagyon stopped. As soon as he saw the long-awaited ice desert, he was shocked. Not like Najin, but like Nagyong. He was brought to his senses by Nuljin and his sudden attack. The battle unfolded again. He thought he needed to come to his senses and figure out how to get out of this situation. After repelling Nuljin's attack, Naryon went to Gios, saying it was a shame that there were knights like him. Something tinkled in Gios' pocket, and he realized that Naryon was stronger than he had expected. Continuing to humiliate Gios verbally, Naryon pulled out a dagger to end it all sooner. But behind Naryon already stood the wounded Nuljin, ready to continue the fight. Watching him, Rujian was angry that the only thing she could do was stay close to the mage. She wanted to fight. She tried to help. Behind her, someone called out to her. Behind her stood Najin, holding his sword as if ready to strike. Gios saw that Noljin was already at his limit and realized that if this continued, someone would definitely die. He knew he had to use what was in his pockets. Standing behind Rujian and putting his sword to her throat, Nagyon asked Noljin and Gios to freeze. They turned around at him and were shocked at what they saw. Noljin shouted, asking what he was doing. Approaching them was Naryun, who also didn't understand what was going on. For Najin, it was a chance. Apparently, Naryun thought there was a spy among them, but he didn't know what the spy looked like or what their abilities were. And turning to Naryun, Nagyun said that it was he who apologized for speaking too late. But Naryun didn't believe so immediately and asked him to initiate him into the details of their case. For some reason, seeing Nagyun's sword dispelled all of Naryun's doubts, and Nagyun knew that if he could gain Naryun's trust, he could learn a great deal. A wound was healing on Yulnia's shoulder. She woke up sitting up, leaning against a tree. In front of her stood Noljin, with torn clothes, and Jiumin, with bags under his eyes and a stick in his hands. Shouting to Gios that she was awake, Noljin was ordered to have Jiumin now heal him. Standing in front of Ruji and Gios, she asked him to tell him what had happened to her squad. Lowering her head, she replied that she didn't know because everyone had scattered in different directions. Gios also wondered what had become of Fitterins, but Rujian didn't know that either because they had run away at once, and answered only that he had been wounded. Looking at Niren, Nagyan said that they would deal with the squad next time, but for now, they should leave. And he added that he'd tell you all about it on the way, but now he had to go. Stopping in the middle of the forest, Naryun turned to Nagyon and asked what the reason was for keeping the squad alive. Naryun's attitude depended on what Nagyun would say. He asked him to explain himself, or else he would condemn him for lying. Of course, Nagyon had nothing to say because it was all about saving his friends. Every word would have weight. He had too little information, but decided to ask if Naryun remembered the mission. Approaching the young man, Naryun grabbed his face, saying that if it weren't for the king's orders, he would have never taken the case. Realizing that Naryun didn't trust anyone, Nagyun apologized for overreacting. Naryun was also very arrogant, so when he let Nagyon go, he told him to watch his mouth if he wanted to live a long life. Turning his back to Nagyon, Naryun said that it was the spy who ordered the mages to be killed, so why didn't he let him do it now? He couldn't just keep quiet, so he explained that the mages needed to reach the capital. Allegedly, they will be more useful alive, and the knight Naryun met is very clever. No one can enter the capital, especially the fortress where the emperor lives. You must undergo an identification procedure. Those words were lies. But the truth was that it required a special magical device to pass, and only that. Nagyun made up a story based on the truth. It was perfect because what he said couldn't be confirmed. In Nagyun's opinion, Naryun would not be interested in why this was so, since he had no choice, and Naryun asked what Nagyun was proposing in that case. Answers that have no clear boundaries fit best, and Nagyun replied that everything was done to have time to prepare. However, Naryun was interested in the details, so he asked for them. But turning away from him, Nagyun said, "First, let's go." If Naryun recognized the sword, it meant he had met its owners. Though it wasn't the best decision, Naryun will try to find out more about the group. Out of the woods came Fitterins, barely able to stand on his feet and leaning on his sword as a walking stick, all wounded. The mage began to heal the wounded wolf, and told him about how Naryun was strong and had powers that caused hallucinations. Thinking that it was a good thing Fitterins was still alive, Gius asked why he hadn't asked for help. Laughing, Fitterins said he didn't know how to do that, but Gius heard differently. Fitterins also cared about how many guys survived and where they were. Fitterins' shoulder was healed. Jesus said he knew nothing about the boys, and that they should go in search of Najin. All the soldiers except Rujian were wounded. Even though they had been treated, they still hadn't recovered fully, so they needed to summon other knights. Once they became knights, they became those who must risk their lives to achieve their goals, and Gios invited them to do their duty. Standing in front of the students, Fox asked them not to forget that they were special. In the future, they would have to carry out assignments and tasks, even at the risk of their lives. Rujian couldn't help thinking that Najin had betrayed them, but it seemed to her that he had a reason for doing so. 3 days passed. Nagyon walked through the forest ahead of Naryun. He thought that if the squad didn't understand, they would consider him a traitor, but that was better. Thinking back to Gios at that moment, Nagyon knew that he only understood him. After all, he had become a knight for a reason. Following the young man, Naryun asked how much longer he had left, and Nagyon replied that it wouldn't be much longer. The problem was that he would soon become suspicious. Juice was asked if everyone had arrived, but he said Varen had not. He deliberately left him out to avoid confusion. Glancing at the knights, he reported that they were now forced to continue the operation with this formation. Walking, Nagyun pondered who the real spy was. Could there be more than one traitor? To begin with, it was necessary to speculate who they might be. It all started then. It was at that moment that he could give himself away by reacting to what was happening. All the proposed traitors must be tied to one man. He's the key link. However, there is no evidence as to the exact number of spies. Nagyun thought the situation should be looked at from a different angle. What is the purpose of those masked men? The names of the knights they called Daran then Ipo must make sense. Are these knights their allies? Considering that Naryun is from the east, then these knights must be their enemies. He would have realized if he met Daran in person. Is it the goal of the masked men to win the eastern continent in battle? Thinking that the east was not the homeland of the masked men, Nagyun wondered what was the point of massacring Najin. Behind Nagyun's back, Naryun suddenly spoke up and said he was overthinking. Nagyun turned around and said he was just a little nervous. Nagyun needed to gather information, and to do that, he needed to win Naryun's trust. Pretending to be Nagyun, he said he didn't think he'd be so close to Naryun as his deeds were legendary. Looking at Nagyun, Naryun paused for a moment and said that he hated sneaks. In Naryun's opinion, the East is full of such people, and they cloud the mind of their lord. They know no boundaries and often overreach. So, Naryun explained to some of them that such actions could have disastrous consequences. He added that even if he was like this now, he was sure Nagyun would remember his essence. Nagyun already realized that he had said too much. Deciding to change the subject, Nagyun said that medicines that are good for the body always burn more bitterly, and added that he had been mistreated. Naryun felt the same way. He said that he had never regretted what he had done, and that the day would come when His Highness would recognize Naryun. Raising his hand and looking at it, Naryun told Nagyun that he was pretty perceptive. Continuing, Nagyun said that he was sure the Emperor would appreciate his merits, and none of the knights could compare to him. The power that knights use is called ki. The power Naryun used was also in this. He pulled out his dagger and looked at it. Naryun shouldn't have used that power. Najin and Naryun stood on the island of blades. Pieces of trees were flying around them. Nagyun couldn't believe what was happening. Pulling his dagger forward, Naryun said he was giving Nagyun a minute to fix it. Not knowing what he was talking about, Nagyun thought he must have said too much. He said something that only these masked men realize. Naryun was already on a low launch to attack. He thought he could do it. Nagyun only wanted to protect the squad, but he overestimated himself. Now he must fulfill. Suddenly, a maroon umbrella opened in front of Nagyun's face. Nagyun saw Rudiku in front of him. From the back, Daran was already flying at Naryun, attacking the enemy. But there was a silhouette behind the tree from where she ran out. It was Jios watching. It was the beginning of the operation to capture Najin. A few months ago, the coast of the eastern continent, the masked men of Naryunu said that after he arrived at the place, their man would escort him. They believed he would do his job well. They were even sure of it because it was the first spear, and the king would surely like it. Pointing a dagger at the man in the robe, Naryun was angry that they had mentioned the king in the conversation. But the man laughed and put his hands up, saying he dared to be disrespectful, and apologized. Smiling at Naryun, the man said that he hoped for further cooperation since, from now on, they were in the same boat. Calling out to Jesus, Rujian said that even though Najin was a jerk, she didn't think he was a spy. Looking back, Jios said that Najin sacrificed himself to save them. The odds of Najin not being a traitor are much higher. Such sacrifices are usually made by knights, not apprentices. Jesus didn't like everything that was going on. He wondered what they would do when they met Najin, whether they would interrogate him or praise him for his courage. They needed to capture Naryun. Daran attacked him, but he just disappeared. And now he's already attacking her from below, while she's looking at where he just was. Hooking the umbrella around Naryun Rudika's ankle, Rudika tossed it aside. For some reason, Daran decided to introduce them by saying that she was a blue raccoon, Rudika, a blue fox, and Jius, a giraffe. The knights lined up, but Fitterins was not among them. Asking Naryun if he was having a hard time lugging around that asshole, Jios informed him that they were there to pick up Nagyun. Warning the girls, Jesus said that the enemy's abilities were unknown, and that he could presumably attack continuously. The knights couldn't let their guard down while Naryun watched them. Fitterins lifted his head and told the girl that she wasn't giving him a breather, and yet she was wounded. He sat leaning on his hands. But Rujian shouted hysterically that they had to run. Behind her, the boys were catching their breath. Using the sword as a support, Fitterins said that they could take a little breather. Schumann stood beside him. Schumann thought about how everyone was having such a hard time, and he was so unsociable. The sun was already setting, and the battle with Naryan was in full swing. The knights had him surrounded. While Darn was fending off several blows at once, Rudik thought, what kind of impenetrable skeleton was this? Standing and watching the battle, Nagyun knew that he was helpless in this situation. However, he thought about the next step. He was sure that Naryun still saw him as a spy, and that's why he was trying to prove himself. Holding the sword in his hand, he thought about how he should use this opportunity. He had two choices, either join the knights now, or continue being a spy and get more information. While Nagyon made his choice, Darn scolded the skeleton with the last words because it was impenetrable. Swallowing the lump in his throat, Nagyon made a choice and raised his sword. He decided to risk his life again. Sitting on his chest, Varen lowered his head and tapped his fingers on his spear. His troop stood beside him. Quarren turned to Varen to clarify whether this was the gathering place where they were standing, and he confirmed it was. Jiren was worried about why there were no other units in sight, but Varen didn't know the answer to that question either. Slashing Flow is an ability designed to fight dragons. Because of the difficulty of using the skill, there are only 2 creatures in the world that possess this ability. While Naryun attacked the knights, Nagyun stood looking at the forest they had destroyed. Fox turned to Giraffe and asked, what about the method of destruction? Gius thought it was tough to defeat a skeleton, and they needed to minimize the damage they could inflict. Turning to Daran to tell her to act according to the situation and be careful, Gius didn't see her. She was already flying at Naryun to attack him, and literally pressed him into the ground. Or rather, she thought so, but Naryun had dodged and was already standing at her side. It flew at Rudica, knocking her to the ground. Behind them stood Juice. The vixen turned to Daran, telling her to calm down or she would die. Najin got a chance, and a sword appeared next to Naryun. Najin stood behind him and said he would help him. The knights couldn't believe their eyes as they saw Najin holding a sword against them. Rushing from his seat, Jius flew towards his student. Naryun glanced obliquely at Nagyon and only smirked. Suddenly, a blade slashed across Naryun's wrist. Nagyun, standing behind him, drew his sword, an unexpected situation that no one had even realized was happening. However, an experienced warrior prefers to react immediately to an attack rather than deal with the situation. The blow flew at Nagyon, but Jius, who was flying towards him, was in time to repel the attack with his foot. That's what Nagyon expected from the knight. He thought that he had trusted him for a reason. Jesus shouted now, and Darn jumped up to attack Naryun. There was an explosion in the forest where the massacre was taking place, and a flash of light illuminated all the trees, flying upwards. Naren stood up and admitted that he had underestimated them, saying that he would now unleash the full power of the slashing stream. But when he turned around, all he saw was the hole from the explosion and the sword abandoned on the ground. Jesus was on Darn's shoulder, and Fox was holding Najin in her arms. They raced through the forest at the speed of light. Darn said the plan might not have worked. She thought Najin was lucky that the skeleton didn't kill him. Nagyun wanted to object, but Rudica stopped him. Frowning at her, Nagyun questioningly said yes, and she replied that he was good. Looking at Najin, Darn noticed something in his hand. Najin replied that Naryun had dropped his weapon, and he thought they could use it. It was Naryun's black dagger of the Emperor's first spear or broken spear. When Naryun realized what had happened, he vowed to find the boy at any cost and destroy him. They walked through the forest in search of Raymond and Moose. Yulia said that if she had practiced better, she could have defeated Naryun. Noljan replied that he knew that. Looking up, Noljan noticed the smoke from the fire and said they needed to go there. The knights stood before Najin, demanding that he tell what he had learned in these days. But Nagyon decided to see if they suspected him. Jesus answered with a question, summarizing that he didn't like to waste his time. He couldn't really tell us anything worth telling. For 3 days, as a spy, Nagyun had not been extracting information, but rather keeping his sanity. He'd learned that the skeleton was a picky eater, but he didn't think it was worth telling. Actually, the fact that he didn't get any worthwhile information doesn't matter, and he told me that the skeleton had a faction that was helping him. What Nagyon needed to know, he found out. He said about the masks. The knights looked at him questioningly. He explained that that skeleton was one with the people who wear the patterned masks. Of course, Nagyon may be wrong, but it doesn't matter. He said that the purpose of these men was to massacre the knights. Because he'd spent 3 days with Naryun, his words meant something to everyone. And he added that there was a spy among them. Darren screamed if he was serious, and Gius asked who the spy was. Since he didn't know that, Nagyon replied that he couldn't find out and could only guess. Turning to the knights, Nagyon asked for a chance to expose the spy. Jaios asked how he would do that, but they were interrupted by Rugian, who ran up to them, yelling that they were all there. Fidorins asked Najin to stop. Looking at the panting boys, Nagyan turned to Fidorins and asked who was missing. The knight reported that Raymond and Musa had not yet returned, and that he had sent Julia and Nuljan after them. As they approached the fire, Nuljan and Yulnia saw Raymond holding her sword, and Moose sitting by the fire. Looking at the guys, Nuljan asked what they were doing there, and why they hadn't gone to the others. After answering that they had been attacked by the crazy skeleton, Musa added that he had tried to run, but Raymond told him to hide and wait for help. Nuljan said that they were hurt too, but Najin saved them. Yulia said to ask why they didn't run away. Surprised, Musa jumped up and shrieked about how they had survived the encounter with the skeleton, but Raymond wondered what Najin had done. Yulia choked as if by accident. Nuljan said that Najin had only managed to distract Naryun. Saying that she thought the knights would save Najin soon, Raymond smiled, and Musa continued to question Nuljan. They decided that they should head back as suddenly a wound opened on Musa's shoulder. Holding onto his shoulder, Musa turned around and saw that it was Raymond. She was standing with a sword in her hand. Informing them that if they let her leave, Raymond added that in that case, she would let them live. Realizing who had been the spy all along, Yulnia and Nuljan prepared for battle. Nuljan wondered if they could defeat her, since they had not yet recovered. Noticing that Raymond looked different from the warm-up fight, Nuljan doubted whether he could defeat her, even if he gave it his best. Confidently, Nagyon stood and said they had to stop him, or they could die. Asking if Nagyon was sure of that, Jaios received an already unsure answer, no. Still, the situation could become dangerous to the student. Looking at Gios, Rudik asked what they would do, and Gios said they would do it like last time. Only the knights would go. Nagyon explained that if Raymond turned out to be a spy, she might not be working alone. A few knights should stay with the squad. Najin's train of thought didn't suit Fidorins because he was furious at the idea that there might be another spy and asked who Najin suspected. The suspects for Nagyon were Pimel, Veron, and Raojun. Such a bouquet the knights had not expected to hear. But Nagyon wasn't finished and named the last one. He thought the blue wolf Fidorins might also be spies. Fidorins first smiled and then clarified why Najin thought that. Glancing at the apprentice, Wolf added that if he didn't provide any proof, then he would have no choice but to doubt Najin. Rudika stood up for the student, pointing her umbrella at Wolf, saying that if he obstructed, it would only increase suspicion. Looking at the vixen, Fidorins asked if she really trusted Najin that much, and reminded her that she had a grudge against him earlier. Najin frowned as Fidorins continued to ask the vixen which she trusted more, the boy or the knight. Jesus interjected into the conversation, asking them to calm down and reminding them that this was nothing more than a conversation. Looking at Giraffe, Wolf said that Yulnia and Nuljan might die while they were wasting time. In Jaius's opinion, if Najin's hunch about Raymond is correct, they should listen to everything he says. Jesus stood before Najin and asked why he suspected Fidorins. Nagyon's logic was that Wolf had chosen Raymond to join his squad. They both took advantage of the situation and guided Naryun all this time. Not seeing this as a good reason, Fidornas asked how it could be trusted, and Jesus replied that they needed to be careful. Folding his arms, Fidorins said he would surrender his weapons and be under constant surveillance. Rudik is left in charge of the Watcher while Gius and Darin go to find Raymond. There was a sound, and Nuljan came out of the forest, carrying Musa's body on his back. Nuljan reported that he was wounded. Thanks to Raymond's exposure, everyone concluded that there were no more spies in the squad. Wolf asked if he really wanted to become a knight. At that moment, Nagyun had no words to answer that question. Nagyun was very different from all of them. He was there for revenge. Looking at the knights, Varen said, "You have arrived." For some reason, he was not happy with what was happening. Turning to everyone, Darin asked what was wrong with him, and Gius advised her to ignore it. Everyone decided to forget the moment. As a result, Suman began to be accompanied by not 5 people, but 14. Since all the squads started the journey based on the mage's movement speed, Najin periodically arranged training sessions. He was learning how to use his new weapon. He realized that he didn't possess the right abilities, and was unsure if he could subdue the spearhead. What if he accidentally destroys the entire forest? Najin has to train in an area with no people. Trying to swing, Najin realized that the tip didn't even want to move and was blocking his hand. Deciding that Wolf could help him since he and Darin have a high level of physical strength, Najin turned to him. It amused Fidorins that Najin had come to him even after suspecting him of espionage. Taking the tip in his hands, Fidorins turned and asked if it seemed heavy to Najin. The wolf swung the tip, and it seemed to Najin that it cut through the air. Bringing the tip above his head, Fidorins concluded that only one person would be able to use it. Najin asked who he was talking about. Looking at the tip, Fidorins noticed that the color of the weapon had changed. There's a good chance it's Naringan. This weapon is the handiwork of an artisan using an unusual technology that may be considered illegal. I needed someone who knew more about Naringen. Noticing that he was being approached, Varen threw a few quips at Najin. Still, the apprentice replied that he wanted to ask him a few questions about Naringen. Saying he couldn't refuse, Varen informed him that talking was too dull for him. Pointing his finger at Najin, Varen asked what Najin would do if he told him he would straighten him out right here and now, saying that if Najin convinced him not to, he'd tell him whatever he wanted. Justifying himself, Paimon looked at the floor and said that he really didn't know anything. Raymond definitely didn't come from their village. Jesus asked when Raymond had gotten there. Paimon replied that it was about 2 years ago. Glancing at Gius, Pimel asked if it was true that she had turned out to be a traitor. Turning away, Jesus said that wasn't true since she had been on the other side from the beginning. After telling Rudike what he had learned from Pimel, Gius asked what about Rao Jun? But as Najin had said earlier, he did not remember anything. Now, the leaders have another task ahead of them. They must supervise the students. Looking at Najin, Varen asked why he was silent. Maybe he hadn't heard him. Najin wondered what Varen was doing and if he was serious. He was far more unpredictable than Nagyon thought. A knight probably wouldn't say such a thing without a reason. Maybe he's testing Najin. Turning to Najin, he asked if his brain only worked in critical situations. Varen was too unpredictable for Nagyun, but if Najin couldn't predict Naryun's actions, Varen could. And Najin, looking him in the eyes, informed him that he had nothing to answer to that. As soon as a strategy is shared with another person, it ceases to be one. So Najin had nothing to say. Varen asked if Najin had any solution to resolve the situation. In this situation, Varen would have liked to hear that Najin had a solution, but instead, Najin answered, "Who knows?" Varen scratched his helmet and said he understood, but there was only one thing that was bothering him. He pulled his spear forward and pointed it at Najin. He calmly asked if the knight was really going to attack him. All the people mentioned by Nagyun as being under suspicion had reasons to be so. However, Raymond was the only one with a good reason. It was perfectly reasonable to suspect Pimel. Varen keeps his distance from others. Raujin can persuade. And then there's Fedorans. He had a peculiar temper. He's obviously going to start following Nagyon because he named the suspects. In other words, Nagyon would need a guard. Looking over his shoulder, Najin thought he saw Fedorans behind the tree. Peeking out from behind a tree, Fedoran said he hoped it was all part of Varen's joke. Realizing that if he continued, the doubts about him would only increase, Varen threw the spear on his shoulder and turned to Najin and asked him what he was interested in. He told Najin that the tip was indeed Naringen. It is necessary to concentrate fully while holding the Naringen. If you succeed with this type of weapon, it will show you its true power. Trying to concentrate, Nagyun picked up the tip and wondered if he was doing the right thing. Maybe he'd been tricked. Looking at Najin, Rujun was worried and asked if he was all right. Najin replied that he was fine, but he hadn't slept well. As Najin continued to train, his strength continued to grow. If he doesn't make progress, he'll never know how Naringen works. There's only one way for him to master the weapon. Reflecting on his difficulties with Naringen, Nagyun thought that Najin would have easily mastered it. There was a rustle behind him. Nagyun turned around and a bright light illuminated him. He couldn't believe his eyes. His brother Najin was standing in front of him. With a shaking hand, Nagyun reached out to touch his brother, but the illusion dissipated. It was a spear ability. It was still impossible to control the weapon, but one of the skills was available to Nagyun. The ability was called Ghost. This power was different from the hallucination-like effect. Nagyun decided to try something out. As the group walked through the forest, they all heard a rustling sound and looked up. Fujian shouted that it was just a bird, and Najin told her it wasn't real. He made sure he wasn't the only one who saw it. The bird looked real, but it would disappear when attacked, or if it was too far away. Initially, the ghost must be created in your head. However, if you do not have an exact idea of what you're trying to develop, it will have no effect. It takes time to catch your breath after using a skill. I'd like to know if Nagyon will be able to shorten the resting time if he trains. At first glance, this ability seems useless. However, Nagyun knew how to use it properly. The masked men were standing at sunset in the village. As they looked away, they saw a girl approaching them and praised her. Raymond came out of the forest with a sword in her hand. The second masked man was surprised that their spy was a girl. She said that she tried to make contact with Naryan as instructed, but Najin intervened. When she realized that the situation had become dangerous, she returned. The man took his chin thoughtfully and asked what had become of their guest. In Raymond's opinion, the guest's strength is excellent, but their plans might fail if they are captured by the knights. The second masked man didn't even realize what the first spear was, but the man felt that Naryun would not give up so easily. Even if he died in battle, he would definitely take a couple of knights with him, and that was good for them. Raymond looked at her interlocutor and said that they would lose a strong ally in such a case, but the man replied that he wasn't sure if Naryun was on their side. Actually, they need to find out what happened to Naryun first. The man's ally nodded his head and went to investigate. He wasn't happy that they were talking to each other as if he wasn't even there. After making sure the ally had moved far away, the man asked, "What about Raojun?" Raymond said they didn't have to worry about him. At this time, Raojun announced that he was training in the trees. Dragon shouted, asking what it meant, and Vadran was convinced that it was useless to talk to him. Watching Darrigan holding his head, Corrin grudgingly reprimanded them because the guys were making a lot of noise. Jirun didn't understand Jiren's remark. She thought it was no big deal because everyone was having a good time, but Turisun didn't know it was a good thing in their situation either. Martha ran up to Najin and offered to fight him, but Najin said he didn't want to. Rujian didn't like the look on Martha's face and concluded that Martha was hard to talk to. A pensive Tar walked beside her, and a sad Pimel behind her. Looking at them, Rujian wondered why they were so gloomy. Riding through the trees, Rudik turned to Gius and asked what he thought about whether or not there were spies among the knights. Jesus answered no. At least, Gius thought they should think so since they were knights. Looking at Gius, Rudik asked, "What about Varen?" However, Gius thought that Varen would never do anything like that. Shielding his arm from the sun, Varen looked somewhere in the distance and said he could see. But the knights could see nothing. Fitterins asked if Varen was sure he could see. It was still far away, but Varen could see it. The capital of the Nizel Empire. Naryun was rushing through the forest at a very high speed. He saw the footprints and turned towards them. His only thought as he ran was to tear Najin apart. Sitting on a rock, Jaeus looked at Vadran, who reported that that was it. Jesus said that in that case they could go. From afar, Nagin watched Darrigan and Vadran. Varagon said that he was very worried and that Darrigan would be next. It may be part of the exam, and Najin's grade would depend on what he said. Turning to everyone, Darn offered to throw Schumann on her shoulder and keep walking. She was sure she could do it. Jesus was against it because the person carrying the mage would be vulnerable, and as long as they went at the speed of the mage, the students could train. Najin was approached by Rujian, who said that Jesus was calling him, and he was the last one. Realizing that Gius still didn't trust anyone, Nagyun came to a conclusion as to why he had called everyone in one by one. Looking at the apprentice, Gius asked what Najin was thinking. The apprentice didn't understand him. Jesus only replied that he had asked him a question. Najin said that his personal opinion was that there were no more spies, but Gius was curious as to why he held that view. According to Nuljan, Raymond decided to retreat when she discovered what had happened. Apparently, she had a mission and backed out of it. That's what Najin thought. And if she had accomplices, then they've definitely been dumped. I mean, Najin means they wouldn't do that. He knows them so well. Lowering his head, Gius sat on a rock, saying that if the spies had other tasks, they were unlikely to reveal their identities. Raising his head and looking at Najin Gius, he said that the apprentice was the only one he didn't doubt, and so he wanted to ask him. Glancing at Gius, Nagyun heard him ask him if Najin was hiding something. He immediately remembered the day his brother died, how the man in the robe had said he had to kill his brother. He hesitated at first, but then he said he wasn't hiding anything. It was amusing to him that Gius didn't doubt him, because even he had always suspected himself of something. Exhaling, Gius lowered his eyes and told Nugin he could go. Already seeming to turn away, Nagyun glanced at the seated Gius, realizing that he was the most reliable person Nagyun could trust. A training session was in progress. Vadran was going up against Duran. Dragon watched from the sidelines, wondering why Vadran was making such strange noises. There were also chivalry lessons where Darrigan said that knights should always be willing to sacrifice their lives. Fitterance wondered if Darrigan's values were valid, or if he thought they were. Is he sure his feelings will match his actions? The second squad was good, but they were easily willing to risk their lives. Next in line was Najin. When Najin stepped into the center, he was asked what, to him, was the most valuable thing he couldn't lose. Each student standing around had a different answer to this question: honor, conviction, justice, confidence, and family. When Najin heard that question, the most precious thing in the world came to mind, and to protect it is his honor. That is the way of the knight. It sounded convincing to Fitterins, but hopeless. Meanwhile, Varen stopped and informed everyone that they had arrived in the capital. The standing students came to marvel at the city's size. From here, they had a new task to begin. Pointing to the main gate, Jesus said that all 14 men must break through the main entrance. As in any capital city, the center of the town is home to an imperial palace where the emperor resides. They all had to break through the main gate. Rujin was shocked and cried out. Behind Jaius's back stood Fox, who didn't understand what a sudden assignment was and who might like it. It could be dangerous out there. If the situation becomes dangerous, they will intervene. It was Gios's decision. Considering future missions, those whose grades fall below the standard will be excluded from the second semester. Already approaching the gate, Fitterins asked if anyone had a plan. Looking at the city guards, Pimmel asked what the word breakthrough meant. After all, assuming that the word meant to go on a spree, Jiren thought that perhaps the knights wanted them to overpower the two guards. Thar believed that no matter how special the lessons were, the students should not be put in danger, and besides, it was against the law. Noljin felt that it was necessary to understand the meaning of the assignment as soon as possible. With a clenched fist, Rujin told Najin that this was his chance because he was the only one among them who could punch a hole in the wall. She laughed at Darrigan and Vadran because they couldn't even leave a scratch using their clumsy skills. But Najin believed that no matter what meaning was put into the words, the main thing was to show results. The two guards at the gate immediately recognized the man who approached them. It was Varen. For some reason, they decided to report the situation to Varen. They stated that nothing unusual had been found at their post. Varen just brushed it off as he walked forward. Pointing a finger at the crowd behind him, Varen said that he was training the trainees, and they were all with him. 14 people in all. One guard started to talk about how it seemed like a lot, but the other one shoved him in the chest with his fist and motioned for everyone to pass. Turning to his partner, the Guardian asked if his colleague wanted trouble on his head because this was the Black Hen. When everyone entered the city, Varen turned around and said he wasn't real and ordered everyone to be captured. The two Varens stood opposite each other. The guards saw two identical people, but realized that one of them was definitely the real one. The Varen standing opposite was carrying a spear, and the guards recognized it as his weapon. Standing across from the frame, Varen realized there was no point in pretending anymore. When the spell dissipated, Nagyan appeared there and gave the command to attack, and the students rushed to storm the gate. Vadran and Thar were the first to attack the guards. Watching from a distance, Rudica said that he mastered the situation very quickly. Hence, the guys realized that a fight was inevitable. Darren didn't understand how Najin pulled off this flawless stunt. Fitterins wondered if Varan had disappeared on purpose for this. The unexpected mission was a test arranged by Gius. If any of the students made a suspicious move, he would catch them immediately. The boys were well prepared. Vadran and Thar, as the most mobile, stood in front. Behind them, the ranged warriors, Daragon Turisun and Paimel. Two people with a martial arts galaxy will attack from the side. At this time, Raojun will prepare his horizontal section skill, while Musakwaran and Jiren will cover the rear. No matter what they say, they're apprentice knights. Gius warned them not to underestimate the guards. They possess the necessary skills to get the job done. Guardians are at almost the same level as knights. They are above the apprentices in the hierarchy. And before Najin could even blink an eye, the guards had finished suppressing the intruders. Already stretching his arms, Fitterins was about to go to the backup, thinking that the guys weren't ready yet, but he was interrupted. But Fitterins started yelling that it was over, and didn't he think the guys could get hurt? Gius asked him if he should stand or go to the police. Trying not to rush, Gius watched another student who was unharmed. Realizing he had no way out, Nagyan pulled out his spearhead. For a weak knight, Gius fought very well. He said he was on the same level as Yulnia, despite everyone having seen the fight with Naryun. Jesus was once strong, but has weakened considerably. Hence the difference in skill utilization. He can use even a small amount of power much more efficiently. But how far can he go with that kind of power? He has been able to accomplish a lot because he knows his limitations. When the guards saw the Naringin in Najin's hands, they advised him to surrender, or he'd get his ass kicked too. Watching the guards, Nagin realized that all he could do was mimic a living being, though that skill was unstable as well. His opponents are strong guards who have defeated all the students. On top of that, Nagyon can't control his weapons. So, he decided to block the opponent's visibility using his unstable ability. The guards were screaming that they couldn't see anything. One of them had something stuck to his eye. Taking advantage of the moment, Najin immediately instilled a sense of fear into the enemy. The guards didn't realize the speed and yelled for them to step aside. The stronger a man is, the more sensitive he is to fear. Nagyon was right about that. Nagyon knew that if their view was obstructed, they would react to the perceived danger by trying to defend themselves because they knew they were strong. Watching the battle, the knights could not understand what Najin had done. Looking at his fellow students, Nagyon saw that 5 people could still fight and figured they still had a chance. Suddenly, a black silhouette of a man appeared behind Nagyon and asked the intruders. Nagyon turned around. Ridiculous coincidence. A girl whose mission was to guard the emperor somehow ended up at the gate. As it turned out, the emperor had to go on business today, so the guards patrolled the path where the trip was to take place. One of the continent's strongest knights is the snow-white elephant of Candentia. Beginner's luck is a term that refers to the phenomenon where beginners often manage to outperform experienced players. This is because beginners have no sense of fear. Unlike experienced players, they do not feel pressure. Therefore, beginners are not afraid to lose, and professional players are not inherently lacking in courage. From an experienced person's point of view, a beginner can do something unimaginable at any moment. Rushing as fast as he could from his seat, Gios shouted to the rest of the knights to run to the students too, because it was an emergency. In his mind, Gios begged Najin not to do anything strange because Candentia wasn't someone he could handle. In a way, she was even more dangerous than Naryun. Meanwhile, Candentia looked at Najin and wondered if he would attack her. Beginner's luck is often referred to as a form of luck. Najin looked at her, wondering if she was a knight or just another test. The guards of the main gate are men who failed the exam to become knights. However, they are strong and capable fighters. Throughout their training, the guards have acquired a great deal of knowledge, but they don't have such a big difference in strength with the apprentice knights. The guards provide good training for the apprentices. That's what Gios thought, but that's not what White Elephant Candentia thought. Many would agree that she is one of the strongest knights. She proved her strength by defeating several knights at a time. That was the problem. Unlike the animal she was named after, Candentia was notable for her ferocity. Many knights would flee when they saw her. The only person who can control Candentia is the dark blue Dalchan turtle. He always asked her for one thing. Clenching her fist, Candentia seemed to think that if she considered the situation before attacking, her conclusions would change. One of the guards was angry, thinking it was intimidating Candentia. It felt like something huge and terrifying was pressing down on them. Looking at the knight, Nagin realized that he was sensing something, and he thought it was an intimidation skill. He thought he'd reached the point where he could sense these abilities. Well, it wasn't really like that. The fact is that Candentia has a power so powerful and sinister that even Nagyan could sense it. The only way to survive was to block the attack. Looking at the squad, the guard didn't understand how they had the strength to move. It looked like Raojun was going to throw up. He was covered in sweat. Fujian was shouting that Najin was a sick lunatic, determined to ruin everyone. Holding her sword in her hand, Quarren bent over, thinking that they were all on another level. Yulnia, standing nearby, yelled that she could still move. In Najin's mind, however, all he had in mind was that he didn't need to forget about the mission. Candentia raised her head and said that he was the one in charge. When Gios arrived at the gate, he saw a pillar of light appear from behind the wall, accompanied by a rumbling sound. Ahead of him ran Fitterans, who hoped they weren't too late. When Varen noticed the knights running past, he exclaimed, "You're all here," and said that the fun was about to begin. On the move, Gios gave Varen a command to stay put because he would only make things more difficult. Left to his own devices, Varen watched the knights run into the gate, and all around on the road lay the bodies of battered apprentices. Fitterans flew into the gate first and shouted for the Lady Knight to stop, but instead, he stopped himself. Juice stopped behind him, asking what was going on. When he saw what Fedorans saw first, Gios's eyes went wide. A capable craftsman can create a masterpiece using the highest technology, and Naringen is a weapon that is often considered illegal. Naringen's abilities cannot be explained by the laws of physics, so it's the strength of the resistance to swing that matters. Even with the necessary force, there's no guarantee that Naringen's abilities will activate randomly, even during a throw. The main condition for the use of such weapons is mastery of the scope. The Naringen senses not the user's strength, but his will. By creating this very well, the Naringen will feel possession even without the use of force, and any physical attack can be prevented. The opponent's strength will be perceived as the force applied to the weapon. Watching as Candentia tried to disarm Najin, but he blocked the blow, Fitteran and Gios couldn't believe their eyes. At this time, Najin thanked himself that his thoughts were right. Otherwise, he might have died. This event was significant because the apprentice prevented the knight's attack. At the same time, the men in robes stopped in the forest. One of them said it seemed to be here, and the other suggested we split up and start searching. Sensing someone approaching, Rauren, standing in front, raised his hand and ordered them to step back. Rauren was attacked by Noryun using an infinite destruction attack. Rauren's minions covered their heads with their hands against the dust and began to cough. Noryun was furious that these wretched men dared to come to him again. Rauren's mask fell from the group, and he stopped Naryun's blow, holding it with his hands. Holding his fist, Rauren said that there was a misunderstanding and asked to talk. Naryun's eyes were burning red with rage. He said that if anyone tried to attack him, he would bury them on the spot. Looking at Naryun, Roran replied that no one was going to attack him. There was a misunderstanding. Taking out his sword, Naryun asked, repeating the same thing as he looked at it since it was the weapon of one of them. The masked men recognized him immediately, and as soon as they said he belonged to them, Naryun didn't let him finish. He shouted that he knew it and called Raurun of the group a miserable creature. Trying to justify himself, Raurun started saying that the guy had golden-colored hair. Naryun demanded that this puppy be brought here to be dealt with. Turning around, Raurun looked at his allies, and they removed their masks. Ruth and Raymond stood there. Naryun asked where he was hiding Najin. Standing in front of Naryun Raurun, he explained to him that Najin was not their comrade, but rather the first person to be eliminated. Naryun asked to swear, and Raurun said that being a descendant of the dragon, he swore by the name of his ancestor. Naryun asked for details, and Raurun decided he was using him to eliminate obstacles. Watching Najin block Candentia's blow, she didn't understand how it was even possible. It was important for Jius to secure the situation by stopping Candentia. But how could he do that? Pulling back her fist, Candentia raised her head and demanded his name. Still watching her intently, Najin carefully called out his name. Deciding that instead of disarming him, Quadrin was trying to knock him down, Najin reached up to wipe the blood from his nose. The students stood around as Canantine ran into Najin. Jius yelled for her to stop. Turning her head, Canantine spotted him. Jesus stretched his arms forward, asking for a chance to explain and talk to Dalchin. She screamed that Jius was a lousy knight, so why was he helping trespassers? What's he gonna do, turn criminal? Shouting back, Jius kept asking to be given a chance to talk to Lord Dalchin. Dalchin is very angry. For him, this was out of line. Canantine stood by his side and thought his words were right, for the boys could have died by her hand. Lowering his head, Jius apologized. He was ordered to follow them so that he could tell them everything in more detail. And a remark flew at Canantine. Dalchin told her to think before she swung her fists. She didn't realize it because she thought she did. Jesus turned around and called Xiumin with him, while the others were told to keep an eye on the boys and eat. He promised to give them a grade for the task upon his return. The guards looked at Najin, saying they had heard of him. Najin looked at Constantine, thinking that he had almost died at the hands of the strongest knight. Looking at his hand, Najin thought he understood a lot. His hunch was correct, and he was able to avoid the Canantine's attack without feeling the impact. He couldn't feel how strong his opponent was. He thought it was strange that the other guys felt her power the first time. However, the fact that he was not affected by the intimidation skill might be an advantage rather than a disadvantage. Someone called out to Najin. It was Rujian. With her hand at her side, she told him to hurry up because they had to eat. Quarren, who had been on her feet during Canantine's attack, told Darrigan that Najin had blocked the knight's blow, but Darrigan didn't want to believe it. Turning to Najin, Yulnia asked him if she could eat his portion if he didn't go with them. Running towards the others, Najin said he would go with them. Standing in the castle opposite, Dalchin folded his arms. Jesus said that one of the generals of the eastern lands had arrived on their continent. He told how they tried to confront him, but the enemy was too strong, and on top of that, there was a possibility of information leaks from within. After listening to Jius Dalchin, it was speculated that the general was most likely one of the Free Knights. Raising a hand to his chin and frowning his eyebrows, Dalchin said they would follow the enemy and let them continue on their mission. Jius tilted his head to show that he understood the order, and Dalchin added that Jius should not use his power unnecessarily. Varen, forgotten by all, stood where he had been, wondering how long he had to stand there. Turning to Jius, Candentia clarified whether she had filled in the knight's name correctly and inquired if he was the knight's apprentice. Jesus answered that Najin had been an up-and-coming and famous candidate even before he was accepted. Dalchin had heard about him too. Candentia reported that she was shocked when Najin was able to block her blow. Dalchin didn't understand how it was possible, because even knights couldn't do it. Putting her hand to her side, Candentia said she tried to neutralize him, but he blocked her blow. She thought Najin must know how powerful she was, but there was no fear on his face. She asked Jius what he thought of him. Looking at them, Jius said he didn't understand him at all. This made Candentia laugh, because Jius used to pride himself on being a know-it-all. A nearby Dalchin concluded that there was something unusual about Najin. It was the first time Jius had ever encountered such a man, and he said that maybe it wasn't Najin's skills at all, but his weapon. Dalchin immediately clarified whether it was Naringan or not. Jesus said that Najin had managed to steal it from that general. Candentia realized the weapon was a shield. In Jius's hands was the very same Naringan. He said that he hadn't been able to figure out exactly what the weapon was, and that it might be from another world. Looking at the tip, Dalchin clarified whether Najin had managed to use the Naringan skill and wanted to say something else, but Candentia asked for Naringan. When Candentia took the Naringen, she found it light. Gius told me that Fitterens tried it too. Stepping aside, Candentia wanted to start on the count of 3, but when she finished counting, she tried to swing, and the Naringen blocked her arm. The disciples were going crazy. Darrigan was going crazy at the thought of what Najin had managed to do, and Vadran was calming him down, saying it was all nonsense. Laughing, Rugian said they were out and missed everything, calling them wimps. Fitterens, who reprimanded the boys, told them to eat because they had a lot of work to do in the afternoon, gave orders to get to work on equipment and weapons. While eating the soup, Najin analyzed the fight with the guards. As Fitterens had said, the guards and Martha had equal strength, so they had a clear advantage in the battle. But it was her that the guards neutralized first. They seemed to know she was the biggest threat. Even when losing, proper concentration and effective use of skills can still lead to success. But to make the proper judgment, one must understand the strength of the opponent at a glance. That's what Najin lacked. Looking at the bowl of soup, Martha clenched her fist because she couldn't do anything. She was gritting her teeth because Najin had lost a practice fight, but managed to block the attack of the strongest knight. Yulia was beside her, looking at her plate. Najin came up to her and said that she was not weak. She raised her head and looked at him. Looking into her eyes, he told her that the plan wasn't a good one, and she trusted him, doing as he said. Closing his eyes, he apologized, saying it was his fault, and they all could have died because of him. Rugian, who was watching from the sidelines, didn't understand what he was apologizing for, and Wadran and Darrigan weren't sure it was Najin. Najin raised his voice and addressed them all, saying that he would not let them be on the verge of death because of him. These words only seemed like an apology at first glance, but it was a psychological maneuver that strengthened Najin's authority in the team. Standing next to the wall was Rudika, who knew what he was really trying to say. From now on, I will make plans and give instructions. Admitting a mistake increases a person's credibility. However, if no one speaks out, it will mean unspoken unanimity. Gius walked into the tavern, saying it was his fault, and so he apologized to everyone. He had no idea the situation would take such a turn and apologized again. With his hands in his pockets, Gius looked at Rodica and asked where Darren was, and she replied that he had gone to Veron. After a week's rest, they will resume their mission. The squads will be reorganized before the next operation. Looking at Najin, Gius asked him to step back with him for a bit. Gius felt especially guilty in front of Najin because he really could have been killed. Najin thought that Gius knew everything. Looking over his shoulder and pulling something out, Gius said he knew no apology would make it up to him, so he let Najin take him away. He asked Najin for the tip, and it fell with a clang onto the tiles. Jesus told Najin to use it, for it was now his weapon. To Najin, the words sounded like Gius was doing him a favor. He thought that since he'd stolen it, the Naringen should belong to him. According to Gius, logically, yes, but legally, no. Found Naringen must be returned to the world it came from and protected. Since Najin was only an apprentice, Gius registered the weapon in his name. Najin looked at his companion and asked about the analysis. Jesus told him that Naringen was unresistible, and even Candentia couldn't tame him. Najin didn't like that. Looking at the weapon, Jesus said it was a very smug and dangerous Naringen, and advised Najin not to trust it entirely. Najin looked at the tip and thought about who not to trust, Naringen or Gius. Jesus also had a question. Looking at Najin, he asked who you were. He replied to Gius that his question was too unspecific and asked him to elaborate. Still, drops of sweat were forming on Nagyon's neck. Without taking his gaze away, Gius asked how Najin managed to prevent Candentia's attack, and reminded him that even knights can't do it, and being an apprentice, it can't be done just like that. Najin is especially weak. It was clear to Gius that the blocking of the blow was due to the Naringen, but in that case, it appeared that Najin had learned how to use it. But Najin had already told Gius what had happened, and thought it wasn't necessary to say exactly how he used the weapon. Realizing that Najin would not share the details with him, much less remove him from the list of suspects, Gius agreed. They stood across from each other. Najin said he didn't suspect Gius, but he couldn't trust him completely. Gius was glad he hadn't suspected him, but at the same time, he was sorry because Najin was the one Gius trusted the most. However, Najin couldn't trust such words, unfortunately. Jesus said that, given the situation, the most important thing was to build trust. Deciding he had no choice, Gius said he would share a secret with Najin. He also said that Najin shouldn't tell anyone or even pretend to know. In Najin's opinion, nothing good would happen if he heard what Jesus told him. Assuring that it would do Najin no harm, Jesus said he would tell him about the debt. Looking somewhere, Candentia clarified if it was the guys they were fighting with. The squad stood up. They were all shaking. Rugian, covered in sweat, shouted that they were apologizing. Someone came up and announced that a special second semester appointment ceremony would be held free of charge. Standing in front of the students, Candinia introduced herself by stating her name and that she was the Emperor's assistant. The ceremony for assignment to the second-line inspection of ammunition rested, and the week went by unnoticed. Standing in the circle of knights, Jaios broadcast that safety was important in the operation, and they should not disclose their mission to the other knights. The knights looked at Darren, and she asked why everyone was looking at her. Darren was the leader of the advanced squad. It included Vadran, Najin, and Martha. As they moved toward the gate, a white-haired young man and a girl stood in their way and asked if they were apprentice knights. Najin had a thought in his head, asking who it was, and Vadran put his hand to his chest, stating that they were the ones. The guy smiled and said that rumors spread very quickly, and also clarified whether the one who blocked Candentia's strike was among them. Darren interrupted him to say that it looked like they should be on their way and waved her hand. When the young man and girl were left behind, Darren exhaled, saying it was awkward. Najin looked back and asked who it was, and Darren told him it was a white raven, a free knight. It was best not to approach him. It was the white raven who created the rift that exists between the knights to this day. There's a strained relationship between class and free knights. Watching Raven Najin, it was probably because class knights act in the name of duty, and free knights despite it. On the hill in front of the capital stood masked men. Naryun asked if they were there, pointing to the capital, but the leader said they had left not too long ago. After reviewing the paper, the leader thought Darren had done a great job that morning. Clutching the paper, he put on his mask and ordered everyone to follow him, saying it was time for retribution. Saying that he was envious, Darrigan turned to Vadran, saying they would stay in the capital and train. Vadran laughed, saying they were weak. Standing next to Najin were Raojun, who advised him to be careful, and Rujian, who told Raojun to worry more about himself. Opposite Tar stood, who also started saying that it would now sound funny. Still, they would definitely get better and rise to his level. Najin looked at his friends and said that this was nonsense. His fight was possible because he had always trusted them and relied on their strength. As Naryun sat by the tree, he was approached and asked if the thing was expensive, but he listened to the question. It was the leader who, looking at Naryun, spoke of Naringin. Of course, the weapon was dear to Naryun because the tip was made by His Majesty. Unusually, this weapon was created by combining the other two. Finally, the leader realized what kind of weapon had stolen the Najin Naringin, which was created from the other two. But is it possible? This will not work with regular guns, but there is a way to do it. Rubbing his chin thoughtfully, the leader checked with Naryun to see if his Naringin had any unusual abilities. Looking at his interlocutor, Naryun said that one skill was enough to destroy everything around him without resorting to the others. Apparently, he was unaware of all the abilities. He didn't need to learn all the weapon skills because he was strong on his own. That's what the leader thought, but Naryun reassured him by saying that there was no need to worry because Naringin would not obey anyone. Naryun was sure that Najin would never be able to use the Naringin properly, and the weapon would become a burden to him. Turning to Najin, Vadran asked how he managed to prevent the Candentia attack. They walked through the forest, and Najin was silent. Vadran demanded that Najin tell him. While Vadran said something to him, Najin looked back at the capital and thought about how he should have taken a better look around Nizal. With 2 thumbs up, Darren shouted that maybe it was time for them to speed up, and Martha, walking beside her, agreed. The boys followed behind them. Thinking that the time had come and he didn't know what contingency might await them, Nagyun decided to test his stamina. They ran through the thicket, and Darren looked back at them, asking if they wanted to rest. Vadran said yes, with a slight raise of his hand to attract attention. Nagyun said he would look for something to eat, and Darren praised him for his initiative.